14-year-old sentenced to life for killing his pregnant mother. 14-year-old Marcus Cole walked into that interrogation room like he owned it. His hands weren't shaking. His eyes weren't filled with fear. Instead, there was something far more chilling, a smirk that made every detective's blood run cold. He leaned back in his chair and said the words that would haunt everyone in that room.
I did it. She is gone.
He had just taken two lives, a pregnant mother and her unborn child, and he acted like it was nothing more than breaking curfew. He thought his age would save him. He thought the system would see a child and show mercy. But there was one thing Marcus didn't count on: a single fingerprint on the kitchen knife, perfectly preserved, impossibly clear. That tiny mark would seal his fate forever. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way, no matter how young the face behind the crime. If you believe in accountability and want to see more stories where truth prevails, subscribe now and tell us what you think in the comments below. This is how it all began. It started on a quiet Tuesday evening in the suburbs of Millbrook, a neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked and kids rode bikes until sunset. Emily Carson was 24 years old, 7 months pregnant, and preparing dinner in her small kitchen when someone knocked on her door. She had no reason to fear. This was her safe place, her sanctuary. But within minutes, everything changed. The laughter that once filled her home turned to silence. The dreams she carried for her unborn daughter vanished in an instant. And the boy who did it? He simply walked away, leaving behind a scene so horrific that even seasoned investigators would struggle to sleep that night. Nobody expected this. Nobody saw it coming. But the truth was already waiting to be uncovered, written in blood, captured in evidence, and sealed by a justice system that would refuse to look away. Emily Carson's neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, hadn't heard from her in 2 days. That wasn't like Emily. The young woman was the kind of person who waved every morning, who brought over fresh cookies on weekends, who always had a smile ready even when her back ached from carrying her growing baby. Patricia had seen Emily just 3 days earlier, glowing as she talked about nursery colors and baby names. She'd chosen the name Lily. So when Emily didn't answer her door on Thursday morning, and when her car sat untouched in the driveway with newspapers piling up on the porch, Patricia's maternal instinct kicked into overdrive. She called Emily's phone 6 times. No answer. She knocked louder, pressed her face to the window, and saw nothing but stillness inside. Finally, with trembling hands, she dialed 911. The officers arrived within 12 minutes. Officer David Reynolds and his partner, Officer Amanda Chen, approached the small brick house with standard caution. The front door was locked. The windows were intact. Nothing appeared forced or broken from the outside, but when Officer Reynolds circled to the back door, he found it slightly ajar, swaying gently in the autumn breeze. He called out Emily's name. Silence answered him. He pushed the door open slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. The kitchen came into view first. Clean counters, a half-chopped onion on the cutting board, a pot of water still sitting on the stove. Then he saw her. Emily Carson lay on the kitchen floor in a pool of dried blood, her eyes frozen in a final expression of shock and terror. Her hands were positioned defensively near her chest, as if she'd tried to protect herself and the life growing inside her. Officer Reynolds had seen death before, but this was different. This was a mother and child, stolen in their own home, in their own safe space. Officer Chen immediately radioed for backup and secured the scene. Within 20 minutes, the house was swarming with detectives, forensic specialists, and the county medical examiner. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived and took one look at the scene before her jaw tightened. She'd worked homicides for 15 years, but cases involving pregnant victims always hit differently. This wasn't just one life taken. It was 2 futures erased, 2 souls denied their chance. The forensic photographer moved carefully around the body, capturing every angle, every detail. The blood spatter patterns told a story of violence and struggle. Emily had fought back. She'd tried to survive, but whoever had done this had been relentless, brutal, and shockingly efficient. The medical examiner knelt beside Emily's body and made a preliminary count. 11 stab wounds, most concentrated around the chest and abdomen. The weapon had been sharp, the strikes deliberate. This wasn't a crime of passion or spontaneous rage. This was something darker. Detective Martinez walked through the rest of the house, searching for anything out of place. Emily's bedroom was untouched. Bed neatly made, baby clothes folded on the dresser, a pregnancy journal sitting open on the nightstand, with the last entry dated 3 days prior. The living room showed no signs of disturbance. The bathroom was clean. Everything pointed back to the kitchen as the sole location of the attack. That meant Emily likely knew her attacker, or at least didn't perceive them as a threat when she opened her door. There was no forced entry at the front. The back door had been left open, kitchen, possibly as an escape route. Detective Martinez returned to the kitchen and noticed something that made her pause. On the counter, next to the cutting board, lay a single kitchen knife, not bloodied, not disturbed, but placed almost deliberately. She motioned to the forensic team, and they bagged it immediately. Sometimes killers made mistakes. Sometimes they left calling cards. Sometimes they wanted to be found. The neighborhood canvass began within the hour. Officers went door to door, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on Tuesday evening. Most residents were shocked, horrified, unable to process that something like this could happen on their street. One elderly man mentioned seeing a young boy walking quickly away from Emily's house around 7:30 that evening, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Kids walked through the neighborhood all the time. Another neighbor recalled hearing what might have been raised voices, but she'd assumed it was a television. No one reported seeing a vehicle or any suspicious adults. The pieces were scattered, incomplete, frustrating, but Detective Martinez knew that cases like this were solved through patience and persistence. Someone always knew something. Evidence always spoke louder than silence. And whoever had done this, whoever had walked into Emily Carson's home and stolen her life, had left breadcrumbs behind. By Thursday evening, the crime scene was processed and Emily's body was transported to the county morgue for a full autopsy. Detective Martinez stood in the driveway as the coroner's van pulled away, watching the sun set over Millbrook's quiet streets. Somewhere in this town, a killer was walking free. Somewhere, they were sleeping, eating, perhaps even congratulating themselves on getting away with it. But Martinez had learned one undeniable truth in her 15 years on the force. Killers always slip up. They always leave something behind. And in this case, that something was already sitting in an evidence bag, waiting to tell its story. She pulled out her phone and called the forensic lab. "I need a rush on prints from the Carson case," she said firmly. "Whatever you find, I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning." The voice on the other end confirmed. The clock was ticking. Justice was already in motion. The next morning, Detective Martinez arrived at the station before sunrise. The preliminary autopsy report was waiting in her inbox, and she read it with cold, clinical focus. Emily Carson had died from multiple stab wounds, with the fatal blow piercing her heart. The unborn child, a girl, had died as a result of maternal death and trauma. Time of death was estimated between 7 and 8 p.m. on Tuesday evening. There were defensive wounds on Emily's hands and forearms, confirming she'd fought desperately for her life. The report noted something else, a small bruise on Emily's jaw, suggesting she may have been struck before the stabbing began. The killer had overpowered her quickly, efficiently. This wasn't someone fumbling in panic. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Martinez closed the file and waited for the forensic results. When her phone finally rang at 9:15 a.m., the voice on the other end was tense with urgency. "Detective, you need to see this. We got a perfect print off that kitchen knife, and it's in the system." Detective Martinez's heart rate quickened as she pulled up the forensic report on her computer screen. A perfect fingerprint match wasn't just lucky. It was a gift from the evidence gods, the kind of break that could close a case in hours instead of months. She clicked through the database results, expecting to see a name with a criminal history, perhaps someone with priors for assault or burglary. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. Marcus Daniel Cole. Date of birth, April 15th, 2009. 14 years old. His print was in the system because he'd been fingerprinted 2 years earlier as part of a school safety program after a minor incident involving a stolen bicycle that was later returned. Martinez stared at the screen, reading the information 3 times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. A 14-year-old child had murdered a pregnant woman with such brutality that seasoned investigators had struggled to process the scene. How was that possible? She immediately called her partner, Detective James Burke, into her office. Burke was a veteran with 22 years on the force and a reputation for maintaining composure in even the most disturbing cases. When Martinez showed him the results, even his weathered face registered shock. 14? He repeated, as if saying it aloud might change the reality. "You're telling me a middle schooler did this?" Martinez nodded grimly. They both knew what this meant. The case would explode into media chaos, political debates about juvenile justice would ignite, and every step they took would be scrutinized by lawyers, advocates, and the public. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was justice for Emily Carson and her unborn daughter. What mattered was getting a dangerous individual off the streets before anyone else got hurt. Burke leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "We need to move carefully here. Everything by the book. If there's even a hint of procedural error, his lawyers will tear this case apart." Within 2 hours, Detective Martinez and Detective Burke were parked outside a modest 2-story house on the the east side of Millbrook. Marcus Cole lived here with his mother, Diana Cole, a single parent who worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. The house needed paint. The lawn needed mowing. A rusty swing set sat unused in the backyard, a relic from Marcus's childhood that no one had bothered to dismantle. The detectives approached the front door with a uniformed officer as backup, though they hoped this would remain calm and cooperative. Martinez knocked firmly. Footsteps shuffled inside, and then the door opened to reveal a tired woman in her late 30s. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Diana Cole looked at the badges, and her face immediately filled with confusion and worry. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice already trembling with the instinct that something terrible was about to happen. Detective Martinez spoke gently but directly. "Mrs. Cole, I'm Detective Martinez, and this is Detective Burke. We need to speak with your son, Marcus. Is he home?" Diana's confusion deepened. "Marcus? What's this about? He's not in trouble, is he?" The detectives exchanged a glance. Martinez continued, "We need to ask him some questions about an incident that occurred earlier this week. Is he here?" Diana hesitated, protective maternal instinct warring with civic duty, then nodded slowly. "He's upstairs in his room, but I want to know what this is about before you talk to him." Burke stepped forward, his tone firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Cole, we have evidence connecting Marcus to a very serious crime. We need to speak with him now, and given his age, you have the right to be present during questioning. We can do this here, or we can do this at the station. Your choice." The color drained from Diana's face. Her hands began to shake. "A serious crime? What are you talking about? Marcus wouldn't hurt anyone." Diana called up the stairs, her voice cracking with barely contained panic. "Marcus, come down here, please." There was a long pause, then the sound of a door opening. Footsteps descended slowly, deliberately. When Marcus Cole appeared at the bottom of the staircase, Detective Martinez felt a chill run through her body. This was the boy whose fingerprint had been found on the murder weapon. This was the face of someone who had taken 2 lives. He was tall for his age, maybe 5'9", with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed somehow too old for his young face. He wore a gray hoodie and jeans, looking like any other teenager you'd pass at the mall or see skateboarding in a park. But when his eyes met Martinez's, she saw something that made her instinctively understand this wasn't a normal kid. There was no fear in his gaze, no confusion, just a cold, calculating awareness that sent warning signals through her trained instincts. Marcus looked at the detectives with an expression that could only be described as mild annoyance, as if they'd interrupted something important. "Yeah?" he said flatly. Martinez stepped forward, keeping her voice steady and professional. "Marcus Cole, we need you to come with us to answer some questions about Emily Carson. Do you know who that is?" For just a fraction of a second, so brief that Diana missed it entirely, a smile flickered across Marcus's face. Then it was gone, replaced by a mask of teenage indifference. "Never heard of her," he said, shrugging. But Martinez had seen that smile. Burke had seen it too. They both knew in that instant that they had their killer standing right in front of them. Diana moved protectively toward her son, her voice rising with desperation. "What is this about? What crime? Marcus, tell them you don't know anything." But Marcus remained eerily calm, his eyes never leaving the detectives. Finally he spoke again, his voice carrying a disturbing confidence. "If you want to talk to me, I guess we should go downtown. Let's get this over with." The ride to the police station was conducted in tense silence. Diana sat in the back seat with Marcus, clutching his hand, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, that this was obviously some terrible mistake. Marcus said nothing. He stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Millbrook pass by, his face expressionless. In the front seat, Martinez and Burke exchanged glances. They'd transported hundreds of suspects over the years, and most fell into predictable categories. The nervous ones who couldn't stop talking, the angry ones who cursed and threatened, the scared ones who cried and begged. Marcus Cole was none of these. He sat with the composure of someone who'd already calculated his next 10 moves, someone who believed he was smarter than everyone else in the car. When they arrived at the station and led him to interview room 3, Marcus walked in like he'd done this 100 times before. He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and waited. The game was about to begin, and he looked ready to play. Detective Martinez set up the recording equipment while Detective Burke reviewed his notes one final time. Diana Cole sat beside her son, her face pale and drawn, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She'd already been read her rights as Marcus's legal guardian and informed that she could request an attorney at any time. She'd declined, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding that would be cleared up quickly. Marcus, meanwhile, sat perfectly still, his eyes tracking every movement the detectives made with an unsettling intensity. When Martinez finally pressed record and stated the date, time, and individuals present, instant, the weight of the moment settled over the small room like a heavy fog. This was it. This was where truth either emerged or hid behind carefully constructed lies. Martinez leaned forward, her voice calm and measured. "Marcus, we're going to ask you some questions about Tuesday evening. Before we begin, I want you to understand that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded slowly, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes. "I understand," he said clearly. Diana squeezed his hand, but he pulled away gently, as if her touch irritated him. Burke opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table, a picture of Emily Carson, smiling, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. It had been taken just 3 weeks before her death. "Do you know this woman?" Burke asked. Marcus looked at the photo for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Burke and shook his head. "No. Should I?" Martinez jumped in, her tone sharpening slightly. "Marcus, your fingerprint was found on a knife in Emily Carson's kitchen. That knife was used to take her life and the life of her unborn child. We need you to explain how your print got there." Diana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's impossible," she cried. "Marcus has never been to that house. There must be a mistake with the fingerprints." But Marcus didn't react to his mother's outburst. He simply stared at the detectives, his jaw working slightly as if he were chewing on his next words carefully. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. In interrogation rooms, silence was a weapon, and Martinez wielded it expertly. She waited, letting the pressure build, watching for any crack in Marcus's facade. Finally he spoke, and what came out of his mouth made even Burke's experienced composure falter. "There's no mistake," Marcus said quietly. "That's my print. I was there." Diana's sharp intake of breath filled the room. "Marcus, stop talking right now. Don't say another word." But Marcus ignored her completely, his eyes locked on Martinez. "I killed her. Is that what you want to hear? I stabbed her 11 times. I watched her fall. I watched her die. And then I left through the back door and walked home. It took me 17 minutes. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were describing a trip to the grocery store rather than a brutal double homicide. Diana began to sob, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with the weight of words that couldn't be taken back. Martinez felt her stomach turn, but she maintained her professional composure. "Marcus, why did you kill Emily Carson?" she asked, her voice steady despite the horror of the conversation. Marcus leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, a genuine smile spread across his face. Not one of warmth or humor, but something darker, something that suggested he was enjoying this moment. "Because I wanted to know what it felt like," he said simply. "I'd thought about it for months. What would it be like to take a life, to have that power? I read about it online, watched videos about murder cases, studied how people got caught. I wanted to do it right. I wanted to experience it fully." Burke's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Martinez felt a cold wave wash over her. This wasn't a confession born of guilt or remorse. This was a teenager treating murder like an experiment, like a video game he'd decided to play in real life. "So, you chose Emily Carson randomly?" Martinez pressed, needing to understand the full scope of his thinking. Marcus shook his head. "Not random, calculated. I needed someone vulnerable, someone who wouldn't immediately see me as a threat. A pregnant woman alone in her house fit the profile perfectly. I'd seen her around the neighborhood, noticed her routine, figured out when she'd be home alone. I knocked on her door Tuesday night around 7:15. She opened it, thought I was lost or needed help. People always underestimate kids. They think we're innocent, harmless. That's their mistake." He said this last part with a hint of pride, as if he'd discovered some profound truth that the rest of the world was too naive to understand. Diana was openly weeping now, her whole world crumbling around her. "You're lying," she sobbed. "You're saying these things because they're confusing you. Marcus, please, tell them the truth." But Marcus barely glanced at his mother. His focus remained on the detectives, and Martinez realized with growing dread that he was actually enjoying the attention, the shock he was creating, the power he held in this moment. Detective Burke decided to press on the details, looking for any inconsistency that might reveal a false confession or mental instability. "Walk us through exactly what happened when she opened the door," he said. Marcus didn't hesitate. "She smiled at me, asked if I was okay, if I needed to use her phone. I told her I was looking for my lost dog and asked if she'd seen it. She said no, but invited me to check her backyard in case the dog had wandered there. That's when I knew I had her. She turned her back to lead me through the house, and I grabbed the knife from the kitchen counter as we passed. It was sitting right there, like it was waiting for me. When we got to the back door, I stopped. She turned around to ask me something, and that's when I did it. First strike was to her shoulder. She screamed, tried to fight back. She was stronger than I expected, even pregnant, but I kept going. 11 times, like I said. When she finally stopped moving, I stood there for a minute, just just watching. Then I wiped the knife handle on my shirt, guess I missed a spot, and left through the back door. The clinical, detached way Marcus described Emily's final moments made Martinez's blood run cold. This wasn't the confession of a remorseful child who'd made a terrible mistake. This was a predator explaining his hunt. Diana was hyperventilating now, struggling to breathe through her sobs. A uniformed officer brought her water and offered to take her outside, but she refused, unable to tear herself away despite the nightmare unfolding before her. Burke leaned forward, his voice hard. "Marcus, do you understand that you killed not just Emily but her unborn baby? A child who never got a chance to take a single breath?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "I know," he said. 2 for 1. I thought about that. Made the whole thing feel more significant, you know? More impactful. The casual way he said it, 2 for 1, as if he were discussing a sale at a store, made Burke's hands clench into fists beneath the table. But he maintained control. Everything had to be by the book. Martinez decided to push further into Marcus's psychology, trying to understand what kind of mind they were dealing with. "Marcus, you're 14 years old. You should be worried about homework, friends, maybe your first relationship. How does a kid your age even begin to think about murder?" Marcus's smile widened. "That's the problem with adults," he said. "You always think age determines capability. You think kids are innocent, simple, incapable of complex thought or action. But I've been smarter than most adults since I was 10. I taught myself psychology, criminal justice, forensic science, all online. I knew exactly what I was doing. And honestly, I thought it would be harder to get away with. I thought there'd be more of a challenge. But here I am, confessing, because dragging it out seemed boring. The experience was the point, not the aftermath." Diana's sobs had turned to quiet, broken whimpers. Martinez looked at this boy, this child who spoke like a cold-blooded killer, and realized they were facing something far more disturbing than a typical homicide case. They were facing a young mind entirely devoid of empathy, conscience, or remorse. The confession was complete, recorded, and damning. But the real question remained: what would justice look like for a 14-year-old monster? After Marcus was formally arrested and processed, Detective Martinez knew they needed to dig deeper into his background. A confession was powerful evidence, but understanding the why behind such incomprehensible violence required more than just his chilling words. She needed to know who Marcus Cole was before he became a killer, what signs everyone had missed, and whether there were any warning flags that could have prevented this tragedy. Burke began pulling school records while Martinez scheduled interviews with teachers, classmates, and anyone who'd had regular contact with Marcus over the past few years. What they discovered painted a picture far more complex and disturbing than either detective had anticipated. Marcus Cole wasn't some obviously troubled youth who'd slipped through the cracks. He was, by most accounts, an exceptionally intelligent student who'd learned to wear whatever mask the situation required. His school records revealed a student with a near-perfect grade point average. Marcus excelled particularly in science and literature, often finishing assignments weeks ahead of schedule and requesting additional challenges from his teachers. Mrs. Rebecca Thompson, his 8th-grade English teacher, sat across from Detective Martinez in the school's administrative office, her eyes red from crying. "I can't believe it," she whispered, shaking her head repeatedly. "Marcus was one of my brightest students. He wrote the most insightful essays about character motivation in the novels we studied. He understood human nature in ways that seemed beyond his years. I thought he'd be a writer someday, maybe a psychologist. Never, ever would I have imagined this." Martinez took notes carefully, asking Mrs. Thompson if Marcus had ever written anything disturbing or violent. The teacher paused, thinking hard. "Actually, now that you mention it, there was one assignment last fall. We were studying Edgar Allan Poe, and I asked students to write their own psychological thriller. Marcus's story was incredibly detailed, very dark, about someone planning the perfect crime. But I thought it showed creativity and understanding of the genre. Lots of students write dark fiction. I never thought it meant anything real." The school counselor, Mr. David Park, had a different perspective when Martinez interviewed him later that afternoon. "Marcus came to see me 3 times last year," Park explained, pulling out a file with sparse notes. "His mother requested the meetings because she was concerned about his social isolation. Marcus didn't have friends. He ate lunch alone, never joined clubs or sports, showed no interest in typical teenage social activities. But when I talked to him, he insisted he preferred solitude, that other kids his age were boring and immature. He said he'd rather read or study than waste time with meaningless social interaction." Park sighed heavily, running his hands through his graying hair. "I noted possible social anxiety or preference for solitary activities, but Marcus never showed signs of aggression, depression, or suicidal ideation. He was polite, articulate, articulate, and seemed well-adjusted in his own way. Looking back now, I wonder if I missed something crucial. But what? How do you identify a child capable of this when they show no obvious warning signs? Martinez and Burke also interviewed Marcus's few acquaintances, kids who'd been assigned to work with him on group projects or who'd sat near him in classes. A 15-year-old named Tyler Chen remembered something unsettling. There was this one time, maybe 2 months ago, when we were partnered for a biology lab. We were dissecting a frog, and most kids were grossed out or uncomfortable, but Marcus seemed really into it. He kept asking the teacher questions about organs, blood flow, how quickly things died when certain parts were damaged. I joked that he was acting like a serial killer, and he just looked at me with this weird smile and said, "Knowledge is power." It creeped me out, honestly, but I figured he was just trying to be edgy or whatever. Another classmate, a girl named Sarah Mitchell, recalled Marcus watching true crime documentaries on his phone during lunch. He was obsessed with murder cases, she said quietly. He'd tell me about different killers, what they did wrong, how they got caught. I thought he just liked the psychology of it, you know? Lots of people watch true crime, but he talked about it like he was studying a manual, like he was taking notes. The detectives returned to the Cole residence to conduct a thorough search with a warrant. Diana Cole sat on the living room couch, staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by the revelation of what her son had done. She'd called in sick to both her jobs and hadn't eaten or slept since the confession. Martinez felt genuine sympathy for this woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her son, never suspecting that behind his quiet, studious exterior lurked something monstrous. In Marcus's bedroom, they found exactly what they'd feared. His computer search history revealed hundreds of queries about murder techniques, crime, scene forensics, how to avoid leaving DNA evidence, and detailed studies of famous killers throughout history. His bookshelf contained titles on criminal psychology, forensic pathology, and true crime cases. But most disturbing was the journal they found hidden beneath his mattress, a leather-bound notebook filled with Marcus's handwriting, documenting a descent into darkness that had apparently been building for over a year. Burke carefully photographed each page before bagging the journal as evidence. The entries were chillingly methodical. 6 months before Emily's murder, Marcus had written, "I've realized that I don't feel things the way other people do. When someone cries, I understand intellectually that they're sad, but I don't feel anything for them. It's like watching actors in a play. I wonder if this makes me different or just more evolved. Most people are controlled by their emotions. I'm free from that weakness." 3 months later, another entry read, "I've been thinking about what it would take to kill someone, not in anger or passion, but as a pure act of will and planning. Everyone says murder is wrong, but morality is just a social construct. If I can do something and get away with it, does it even matter? The only real crime is getting caught." The entries grew progressively darker, more focused, until 2 weeks before the murder, Marcus had written a detailed plan that matched exactly what he'd confessed to doing. Martinez sat in the police station's conference room that evening, the journal spread open before her, feeling a profound sense of dread. They weren't just dealing with a violent teenager who'd acted impulsively, they were dealing with a carefully calculating mind that had systematically suppressed or simply never developed the capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. She'd seen adult psychopaths before, people whose brains seemed wired differently, who viewed other humans as objects to be used or discarded. But seeing it in someone so young, someone who should still be developing, still learning right from wrong, was deeply unsettling. Burke joined her, carrying 2 cups of terrible coffee from the station's ancient machine. "The prosecutor's office is already preparing their case," he said quietly. "They're going for adult charges. First-degree murder, 2 counts. With premeditation this clear, they're confident they can get a conviction." Martinez nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "The defense is going to argue that a 14-year-old brain isn't fully developed, that he can't be held to adult standards of culpability." Burke took a sip of his coffee and grimaced at the taste. "Maybe his brain isn't fully developed," he said, "but that journal shows planning, forethought, and a clear understanding of right and wrong. He knew what he was doing was illegal and immoral. He just didn't care. That's not diminished capacity, that's pure sociopathy." Martinez closed the journal, unable to look at Marcus's neat handwriting anymore. "What about Diana?" she asked. "What did we miss in that home that might have contributed to this?" They'd found no evidence of abuse, neglect, or trauma in Marcus's upbringing. Diana had been a devoted single mother, working multiple jobs to provide for her son, making sure he had food, clothing, educational opportunities. She'd attended parent-teacher conferences, encouraged his studies, and tried her best despite limited resources. By all accounts, she'd done everything a good parent should do, yet somehow her son had become a killer. The question that haunted Martinez was whether anything could have been done differently, or if Marcus Cole was simply born with something fundamentally broken inside him. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court would take weeks to complete, but the preliminary assessment from Dr. Helen Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who'd interviewed Marcus twice, was already concerning. This young man displays classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, Dr. Rodriguez had told Martinez privately. He lacks empathy, shows no genuine remorse, demonstrates superficial charm when it suits him, and possesses an inflated sense of self-worth. What's particularly troubling is how young he is. Typically, we don't diagnose personality disorders in adolescence because their personalities are still forming. But Marcus exhibits such pronounced symptoms that I'm comfortable saying his psychological profile is extremely dangerous. He views other people as objects, not as individuals with thoughts, feelings, and rights. In his mind, Emily Carson wasn't a person. She was an experiment, a means to satisfy his curiosity about death and his own power. The doctor's words echoed in Martinez's mind as she prepared the case file for the prosecutor's office. Justice for Emily and her daughter was coming, but it would be complicated, controversial, and heartbreaking in ways that transcended the typical homicide case. 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest, Diana Cole sat in the office of public defender Catherine Walsh, a seasoned attorney who'd reluctantly agreed to represent the boy who'd confessed to such a heinous crime. Catherine had built her career defending juveniles, believing deeply that children deserved second chances and that the system too often failed to consider the complexities of youth. But this case tested every principle she held dear. Diana looked 20 years older than she had just weeks ago. Her hair had gone unwashed, dark circles hollowed her eyes, and her hands trembled constantly as if her body couldn't process the shock that had shattered her world. "I need you to understand something," Catherine said gently but firmly. "Marcus confessed. The evidence is overwhelming. My job isn't to prove he's innocent. It's to argue that he should be tried as a juvenile and given a chance at rehabilitation rather than spending his entire life in prison. To do that effectively, I need to understand his history, his home life, anything that might explain how he arrived at this point." Diana's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "I worked 2 jobs my entire life to give him opportunities. His father left when Marcus was 3. I never let Marcus go without. I made sure he had books, a computer for school, everything he needed. I thought I was doing everything right." Tears streamed down her face as she continued. "He was always quiet, always in his room reading or doing homework. I thought I'd raised a good kid, you know, a smart kid who'd go to college, have a better life than I did. How could I not see what he was becoming?" Catherine took notes, her expression sympathetic but focused. "Did Marcus ever show signs of violence as a child? Did he hurt animals, start fires, get into fights?" Diana shook her head firmly. "Never. He was gentle with our cat when we had one. He never got into trouble at school. He just kept to himself. I worried sometimes that he was too isolated, that he didn't have friends, but he always said he didn't need them. He said other kids were immature and he preferred being alone." The conversation lasted 2 hours, with Catherine probing every aspect of Marcus's childhood, looking for anything that might build a case for rehabilitation. But the picture that emerged was frustratingly ordinary. A single mother doing her best. A quiet child who excelled academically. No obvious trauma or abuse that could explain his transformation into a killer. Finally, Catherine asked the question that Diana had been dreading. "Do you believe your son can be rehabilitated? Do you believe there's hope for him to one day rejoin society?" Diana broke down completely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. When she finally composed herself enough to speak, her answer was devastating in its honesty. "I don't know," she whispered. "When I look at him during jail visits, when I see his face through that glass, I don't recognize him anymore. He's my son, my baby, but there's something missing. It's like looking at a stranger wearing Marcus's face. He doesn't cry, he doesn't apologize, he just sits there looking bored, like this is all a minor inconvenience. What kind of mother am I if I can't even answer whether my own child deserves mercy?" Meanwhile, across town, Emily Carson's family was preparing to face Marcus in court. Emily's mother, Patricia Hayes, had aged a decade in the 3 weeks since her daughter's murder. She'd been planning to be a grandmother, had already bought clothes and toys for the baby girl Emily planned to name Lily. Now, instead of celebrating life, she was preparing victim victim impact statements and attending meetings with prosecutors. Patricia's husband, Robert, had barely spoken since the funeral. He sat in their living room staring at photo albums filled with pictures of Emily, birthday parties, high school graduation, the day she'd announced her pregnancy with such joy it had filled their entire home with light. That light was gone now, extinguished by a 14-year-old boy they'd never met, who'd decided their daughter's life meant nothing more than an experiment in satisfying his dark curiosity. The Hayes family wanted justice, but what did justice even look like when the killer was still a child himself? The prosecutor assigned to the case, District Attorney Michael Brennan, was a 48-year-old veteran with a reputation for being tough but fair. He'd prosecuted hundreds of cases, but juvenile defendants charged with adult crimes always presented unique challenges. In a meeting with the Hayes family, Brennan laid out his strategy. "We're charging Marcus Cole as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The premeditation is clear from his journal entries, his internet search history, and his own confession. The defense will argue that he's too young to be held fully accountable, that his brain isn't developed enough to understand the full weight of his actions. But the evidence shows he knew exactly what he was doing. He planned it, he executed it, and he showed absolutely no remorse afterward." Patricia Hayes listened, her jaw tight. "What kind of sentence are you seeking?" she asked, her voice thick with grief and anger. Brennan met her eyes directly. "Life in prison without the possibility of parole. He took 2 lives with calculation and coldness. Age doesn't excuse that." The legal battle lines were being drawn, and the community of Millbrook found itself bitterly divided. Some residents believed that Marcus, despite his crime, was still a child who deserved a chance at rehabilitation. They pointed to neuroscience research showing that adolescent brains weren't fully developed, particularly in areas governing impulse control and long-term consequence assessment. Others argued that the brutal, premeditated nature of his crime demonstrated a level of evil that transcended age. Local churches held prayer vigils, some for Emily and her lost baby, others for Marcus and his devastated mother. Talk radio shows exploded with callers debating juvenile justice, mental health, and whether society had failed to protect children from becoming monsters. The case had become more than just a murder trial. It had become a referendum on how society should respond when children commit adult crimes. And at the center of it all was Marcus Cole, sitting in a juvenile detention facility, reading books and showing the same eerie calm he'd displayed since his arrest. Detective Martinez visited Marcus twice more before the trial, hoping to understand what drove him, what made him different from other 14-year-olds. During their second meeting, she asked him directly, "Marcus, do you understand that Emily Carson had a family who loved her, that her mother will never recover from losing her daughter and granddaughter?" Marcus looked at her with those unsettlingly flat eyes and responded, "I understand that intellectually, but I don't feel it. It's like when someone tells you a story about people you've never met. You might think it's sad in an abstract way, but it doesn't really affect you. That's how I experience everything. I know what emotions I'm supposed to feel, but I don't actually feel them. Does that make sense?" Martinez felt a chill run through her. "So you're telling me you're incapable of empathy?" Marcus considered this. "I think empathy is overrated. It clouds judgment and makes people weak. I can simulate it when necessary. I know what to say, how to act, but genuinely feeling another person's pain? No, I don't have that. And honestly, I don't see why I'd want it." That conversation haunted Martinez for weeks. She'd dealt with many criminals who justified their actions or showed selective empathy, but Marcus was different. He wasn't justifying or rationalizing. He was simply stating a fact about how his mind worked, with no more emotion than if he'd been describing his height or eye color. Dr. Rodriguez's psychological evaluation, when it was finally completed, confirmed what Martinez had suspected. Marcus Cole exhibits profound antisocial personality traits with narcissistic features. His cognitive empathy is intact. He can understand intellectually what others are feeling, but his affective empathy is essentially absent. He doesn't feel emotional connections to other people. This, combined with above-average intelligence and a need for stimulation, created a dangerous combination. He saw Emily Carson's murder not as the destruction of a human life, but as an intellectual challenge and a novel experience. In my professional opinion, Marcus represents an extreme risk for future violence and shows no indicators that suggest he's capable of genuine rehabilitation. The report landed on District Attorney Brennan's desk like a bomb. He'd been prepared to argue for adult charges based on the premeditation and brutality of the crime, but having expert psychological testimony that Marcus was essentially a young psychopath made the case even stronger and far more disturbing. At the same time, defense attorney Catherine Walsh read the same report and realized her job had just become nearly impossible. How do you argue for rehabilitation when experts say the defendant lacks the fundamental emotional capacity for genuine change? She'd have to focus on his age, the possibility that his brain might still develop empathy pathways as he matured, and the moral question of whether society should give up entirely on a 14-year-old, no matter how damaged he appeared to be. The stage was set for a trial that would challenge everyone's assumptions about justice, youth, and the very nature of evil itself. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, reporters jockeying for position, their cameras capturing every person who entered through the heavy oak doors. Inside, the gallery was divided. On one side sat Emily Carson's family and supporters, their faces etched with grief and determination. On the other side sat a handful of juvenile justice advocates and a few members of Diana Cole's extended family who'd reluctantly shown up despite their horror at what Marcus had done. Diana herself sat in the front row behind the defense table, her eyes hollow, her body seeming to fold in on itself under the weight of unbearable shame and sorrow. Security was tight. The bailiffs had received threats from both sides, people who thought Marcus deserved immediate punishment and others who believed trying a child as an adult was itself a crime. The Honorable Judge Margaret Thornton entered promptly at 9 a.m., her silver hair pulled back, her expression grave. She'd been on the bench for 18 years and had presided over some of the county's most difficult cases, but this one was different. This one would test the very limits of the justice system. Marcus entered through a side door, escorted by two deputies. He wore a button-down shirt and dress pants that his mother had brought for him, clothes that made him look even younger than his 14 years. His hair had been neatly combed, and his expression was carefully neutral. As he took his seat next to Catherine Walsh, he glanced briefly at Emily's family, his face registering nothing. No shame, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain his actions had caused. Patricia Hayes stared at him with such intensity that it seemed she was trying to bore into his soul, searching for any sign of humanity, any flicker of the child he was supposed to be. She found nothing. Marcus simply looked away, his attention shifting to the judge as if this were any other school assembly he was obligated to attend. Judge Thornton addressed the packed courtroom, her voice firm and commanding. "This trial will be conducted with decorum and respect. I will not tolerate outbursts, disruptions, or any behavior that undermines the integrity of these proceedings. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. District Attorney Michael Brennan stood to deliver his opening statement, and the room fell into absolute silence. He approached the jury box slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice clear and measured, "you're about to hear a story that will challenge everything you believe about childhood innocence. We've all been taught that children are inherently good, that they deserve protection and second chances, that their mistakes should be forgiven because they don't yet understand the world. But what you'll hear in this courtroom over the coming days isn't a story about a child making a mistake. It's a story about a young person who carefully, methodically, and with full awareness of what he was doing, planned and executed the murder of a pregnant woman and her unborn child." Brennan paused, letting his words sink in. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emily Carson was 24 years old. She was 7 months pregnant with a baby girl she'd already named Lily. She was preparing dinner in her own home, in a safe neighborhood, when Marcus Cole knocked on her door. She opened that door with kindness, with trust, with the basic human decency we all hope still exists in this world. And Marcus Cole repaid that kindness by stabbing her 11 times, taking not one life, but 2. Brennan walked slowly along the jury box, making eye contact with each member. "The defense will tell you that Marcus is just a child, that his brain isn't fully developed, that he deserves mercy because of his age. But the evidence will show you something else entirely. You'll hear Marcus's own words, his confession given freely and in detail. You'll see his journal entries spanning over a year, documenting his desire to kill, his careful planning, his complete lack of regard for human life. You'll hear from forensic psychologists who evaluated him and found a mind that understands right from wrong but simply doesn't care. This isn't a case about a troubled child acting impulsively. This is a case about a calculating individual who chose murder as if he were were choosing what to have for dinner. The prosecutor returned to his table and picked up a photograph of Emily, holding it up for the jury to see. Emily Carson will never watch her daughter take her first steps. She'll never hear her say mama for the first time. She'll never experience the joy of motherhood because Marcus Cole decided her life was nothing more than an experiment to satisfy his curiosity about death. That's not childhood innocence. That's murder, and it deserves to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. When Brennan sat down, the courtroom remained heavy with tension. Catherine Walsh stood slowly, straightening her suit jacket, and approached the jury with a very different demeanor. Her voice was softer, more reflective. Members of the jury, everything Mr. Brennan just told you about the facts of this case is true. Marcus Cole did kill Emily Carson. He did confess to it. The evidence is overwhelming, and we don't dispute that. But what Mr. Brennan didn't tell you is equally important. He didn't tell you about the neuroscience research that shows adolescent brains, particularly in 14-year-olds, are fundamentally different from adult brains. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, impulse control, and understanding long-term consequences, isn't fully developed until a person's mid-20s. Marcus's brain was literally incapable of processing the full weight and permanence of his actions. Walsh moved closer to the jury, her expression earnest. I'm not asking you to excuse what Marcus did. What happened to Emily Carson and her unborn daughter is a tragedy that can never be undone. But I am asking you to consider whether a 14-year-old child should be sentenced to die in prison for actions taken when his brain was still forming, Walsh continued, her voice gaining strength. Our justice system has always recognized that children are different from adults. That's why we have juvenile courts, why we don't let kids vote or serve on juries or sign legal contracts. We recognize that young people lack the maturity and judgment of adults. So why, when it comes to punishment, do we suddenly decide that this same young person should be treated as if he has the full cognitive capacity of a mature adult? The answer is emotion. We're angry, rightfully so. We want someone to pay for this horrible crime. But justice isn't about revenge. It's about making rational decisions based on evidence and the possibility of redemption. She gestured toward Marcus, who sat impassively at the defense table. Marcus Cole is 14 years old. His personality is still forming. His capacity for change, for growth, for developing the empathy he currently lacks, all of that is still possible. Brain plasticity in adolescence means that rehabilitation isn't just theoretical, it's real. Studies show that even young people with severe behavioral problems can change as they mature. If we sentence Marcus to life without parole, we're saying that we believe a child is irredeemable, that there's no hope for growth or change. Is that really the message we want to send as a society? The contrast between the two opening statements couldn't have been starker. Brennan had painted Marcus as a monster hiding behind the shield of youth. Walsh had portrayed him as a damaged child whose brain hadn't yet given him the tools to make proper decisions. The jury would have to decide which narrative they believed. Judge Thornton called for a brief recess before the prosecution began presenting witnesses. During the break, Marcus remained seated, showing no reaction to either opening statement. His mother leaned forward from the gallery, whispering his name, trying to get his attention. He turned slightly and gave her a small nod, but there was no emotion in the gesture, no reassurance or connection. Diana pulled back, tears streaming down her face, realizing once again that her son was somewhere she couldn't reach him. On the other side of the courtroom, Patricia Hayes clutched her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They'd just heard their daughter's murder described in clinical detail, had seen the boy who'd killed her sitting there looking bored and disconnected. The rage they felt was almost unbearable. When court reconvened, District Attorney Brennan called his first witness, Officer David Reynolds, the officer who'd first discovered Emily's body. Reynolds took the stand and was sworn in, his face somber as he prepared to relive that terrible day. Brennan guided him through his testimony methodically. Officer Reynolds, please describe for the jury what you found when you entered Emily Carson's home on that Thursday morning. Reynolds' voice was steady but tinged with the weight of the memory. When we entered through the back door, we immediately saw the victim lying on the kitchen floor. There was significant blood loss. Her eyes were open, and her hands were positioned near her chest in what appeared to be a defensive posture. It was clear she'd fought back against her attacker. Brennan presented crime scene photographs, each one projected onto a large screen for the jury. Several jury members looked away, their faces paling at the graphic nature of the images. Officer Reynolds, in your 15 years of police work, how would you characterize this crime scene? Reynolds didn't hesitate. It was one of the most violent scenes I've ever encountered. encountered. The number of wounds, the brutality of the attack, it spoke to either extreme rage or complete detachment. There was no mercy shown. The prosecution's case built methodically over the following days. Forensic experts testified about the fingerprint evidence, the blood spatter patterns that showed Emily had been conscious and fighting for several minutes, and the autopsy results that detailed each of her 11 stab wounds. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly difficult for Emily's family to hear. Dr. James Patterson explained clinically how each wound had damaged vital organs, how Emily would have experienced excruciating pain, how she would have known she was dying and powerless to stop it. "And what about the fetus?" Brennan asked. Dr. Patterson's voice softened. "The fetus was viable and would have survived if delivered immediately, but as the mother's system shut down, the baby was deprived of oxygen and nutrients. Based on my examination, the fetus likely survived for several minutes after the mother's death before its own heart stopped. In effect, that child fought for life even after her mother was gone." The courtroom was silent except for Patricia Hayes's quiet sobs. Marcus sat at the defense table, his expression unchanged, as if the testimony were about strangers in a story rather than people whose lives he'd ended. Detective Sarah Martinez took the stand on the third day of trial, and her testimony would prove to be one of the most damaging pieces of the prosecution's case. Brennan approached her with confidence, knowing that Martinez's credibility and experience would carry significant weight with the jury. "Detective Martinez, please walk the jury through the investigation that led you to Marcus Cole." Martinez nodded, her posture professional and composed. "We received the fingerprint match on Friday morning, approximately 36 hours after the victim's body was discovered. When we saw that the print belonged to a 14-year-old, our first reaction was disbelief. We double-checked the results, had the lab run the comparison again, because it seemed impossible that someone so young could be responsible for such a brutal crime. But the evidence was irrefutable. That fingerprint belonged to Marcus Cole, and it was found on the murder weapon in a position consistent with someone gripping the knife handle firmly during use. Brennan presented the knife itself, sealed in an evidence bag, holding it up for the jury to see. Several members recoiled slightly at the sight of the dried blood still visible on the blade. "Detective, what happened when you went to the Cole residence to question Marcus?" Martinez's expression darkened slightly. "We arrived around 10 a.m. that Friday. His mother answered the door and was understandably confused and worried. When we asked to speak with Marcus, he came downstairs and I observed something that made my instincts immediately alert. There was no fear in his eyes, no confusion about why police were at his door. Instead, there was something I can only describe as anticipation, almost excitement. When I mentioned Emily Carson's name and asked if he knew her, I saw a brief smile flicker across his face before he denied knowing her. That smile told me everything I needed to know." The jury listened intently, several members taking notes. "What happened next?" Brennan prompted. "We asked Marcus to come to the station for questioning. He agreed immediately, almost eagerly. During the car ride, while his mother was panicking and trying to reassure him, Marcus was calm, looking out the window like he was on a field trip. When we got him into the interrogation room and informed him of his rights, he waived them without hesitation, and then he confessed." Martinez paused, making eye contact with the jury. But this wasn't a confession born of guilt or remorse. Marcus described Emily's murder in clinical detail, explaining his thought process, his planning, and his motivations with the detachment of someone describing a science experiment. He told us he'd been curious about what it would feel like to kill someone. He said he'd chosen Emily because she was vulnerable and wouldn't see him as a threat. He described stabbing her 11 times, watching her die, and then calmly walking home. And through all of it, he showed absolutely no emotion except what seemed like pride in having successfully executed his plan. Brennan played the video recording of Marcus's confession for the jury. The courtroom fell into heavy silence as they watched the 14-year-old boy on screen casually describing how he'd murdered a pregnant woman. His voice was steady, his demeanor relaxed, and his words were chillingly precise. When he described Emily opening her door with a smile, offering to help him find his supposedly lost dog, several jury members shook their heads in disbelief. When he described the actual killing, I grabbed the knife from the counter as we passed through the kitchen. When she turned around, I stabbed her in the shoulder first. She screamed and tried to fight back, but I kept going. Patricia Hayes fled the courtroom, unable to bear hearing her daughter's final moments described so callously. Video ended with Marcus saying, "2 for 1. I thought about that. Made the whole thing feel more significant, you know?" The jury sat in stunned silence. This wasn't secondhand testimony or theoretical evidence. This was Marcus himself, in his own words, demonstrating a level of cold calculation that seemed incompatible with his young age. During cross-examination, Catherine Walsh approached Detective Martinez carefully. She knew attacking the detective's credibility would backfire, so instead she focused on context. Detective Martinez, you mentioned being shocked that a 14-year-old could commit this crime. That shock came from your understanding that children's brains work differently from adults, correct? Martinez considered the question. I was shocked because of the brutality and premeditation, yes. Walsh pressed on. And isn't it true that during your interview with Marcus, his mother was present and could have stopped the questioning at any time? Martinez nodded. Yes, his mother was present, as required by law when questioning a minor. Walsh continued. Did you at any point have Marcus evaluated by a child psychologist before conducting this interrogation? Someone trained in understanding adolescent cognitive development? Martinez's expression tightened slightly. No, we had a suspect who'd confessed to a double homicide. Our priority was documenting his statement and securing evidence. Walsh let that hang for a moment. So you questioned a 14-year-old child about a capital crime without ensuring he had psychological support or fully understood the implications of waiving his rights? Brennan objected immediately. Your Honor, the detective followed proper procedures. The defendant's mother was present, he was read his rights, and he chose to speak freely. Judge Thornton sustained the objection, but Walsh had made her point to the jury. Marcus was still a child, and perhaps the system had failed to protect him from himself. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from the forensic psychologist, Dr. Helen Rodriguez. She'd spent 10 hours across multiple sessions evaluating Marcus, conducting standardized psychological tests, and attempting to understand his cognitive and emotional functioning. Brennan guided her through her credentials, 2 decades of experience, hundreds of forensic evaluations, expertise specifically in juvenile offenders, before getting to the heart of her testimony. Dr. Rodriguez, based on your evaluation of Marcus Cole, what is your professional opinion regarding his mental state at the time of the crime? Dr. Rodriguez spoke clearly and without hesitation. Marcus exhibits traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features. While we typically avoid diagnosing personality disorders in adolescents because their personalities are still developing, Marcus's profile is so pronounced that I believe the diagnosis is appropriate. Brennan asked her to elaborate for the jury. In layman's terms, what does that mean? Dr. Rodriguez turned slightly toward the jury box. It means that Marcus lacks the capacity for genuine empathy. He can intellectually understand that other people have feelings, but he doesn't emotionally connect with those feelings. Other people aren't real to him in the way they are to most of us. They're more like characters in a story, interesting to observe but not genuinely meaningful. This allows him to harm others without experiencing guilt or remorse because he doesn't truly comprehend them as beings who matter. She paused before continuing. Marcus also exhibits grandiosity, an inflated sense of his own intelligence and importance. He believes he's smarter than most people, including adults, and views typical social and moral rules as constraints that don't apply to him. When combined with his need for novel stimulation and his lack of fear response, these traits created a dangerous profile. He was bored, he was curious about killing, and he lacked the emotional barriers that prevent most people, including most children, from ever acting on such thoughts. Brennan presented several pages from Marcus's journal, which Dr. Rodriguez had reviewed during her evaluation. Doctor, what do these journal entries tell you about Marcus's state of mind in the months leading up to the murder? Dr. Rodriguez examined the pages, though she clearly knew them well already. These entries show progressive desensitization and planning. 6 months before the crime, Marcus was theorizing about killing. 3 months before, he was actively planning. 2 weeks before, he'd identified his target and method. This isn't impulsive behavior or a child acting without understanding. This is methodical preparation by someone who understood exactly what he intended to do and spent months working up to it. Brennan's final question was the one that mattered most. Dr. Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, did Marcus Cole understand the difference between right and wrong when he murdered Emily Carson? The courtroom held its breath. Absolutely, Dr. Rodriguez stated firmly. Marcus understood that killing was wrong both morally and legally. He simply didn't care. That's the defining characteristic of his psychological profile. Not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of conscience. Catherine Walsh's cross-examination of Dr. Rodriguez focused on the one area where she might gain ground, the question of whether Marcus's condition was permanent or potentially treatable. Dr. Rodriguez, you mentioned that personality disorders are typically not diagnosed in adolescence because their personalities are still forming. Doesn't that suggest that Marcus's psychological profile could still change as he matures? Dr. Rodriguez considered her answer carefully. It's theoretically possible that as Marcus's brain continues to develop, particularly his his prefrontal cortex. He could develop greater capacity for emotional regulation and empathy. However, I must be honest, the research on treating severe antisocial traits in adolescence shows very limited success. Most individuals who exhibit this profile in their teens continue to exhibit it in adulthood. Walsh pressed further. But very limited success isn't the same as no success, correct? There are documented cases of young people with severe behavioral problems who went on to live productive, nonviolent lives. Dr. Rodriguez nodded reluctantly. Yes, there are cases, but they're the exception rather than the rule, and they typically involve intensive intervention and treatment over many years. Walsh then introduced testimony from her own expert, Dr. Thomas Brennan, a neuropsychologist who specialized in adolescent brain development. Dr. Brennan presented brain scan images and research data showing how dramatically different teenage brains were from adult brains. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and understanding consequences, undergoes massive reorganization during adolescence, Dr. Brennan explained, pointing to highlighted areas on the brain scans. A 14-year-old quite literally does not have the same capacity for judgment and decision-making as an adult. This isn't a moral failing, it's neurobiology. He went further, presenting studies showing that juveniles, even those who committed serious crimes, showed significantly lower recidivism rates than adults when given appropriate rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. The brain's plasticity during adolescence means this is actually the optimal time for intervention and treatment. If we simply warehouse young offenders in adult prisons without age-appropriate programming, we guarantee they'll never develop the neural pathways necessary for empathy and moral reasoning. But on cross-examination, Brennan the prosecutor skillfully undermined Dr. Brennan the expert. Doctor, all of your research is about typical adolescent development, correct? The neuropsychologist nodded. These studies involve average teenagers making impulsive decisions, shoplifting, getting into fights, experimenting with substances. Is that correct? Dr. Brennan had to agree. Yes, most juvenile justice research focuses on typical offenders. The prosecutor leaned in. But Marcus Cole isn't a typical offender, is he? He didn't act impulsively. He planned a murder for months. He studied forensics to try to avoid getting caught. He selected a vulnerable victim and executed his plan with precision. Does your research on typical adolescent impulsivity really apply to someone who demonstrates that level of premeditation? Dr. Brennan faltered slightly. Well, even with planning capability, his brain was still not fully developed, but the damage was done. The prosecutor had successfully separated Marcus from the sympathetic category of impulsive teenager and placed him in a far more disturbing category, calculating predator who happened to be young. The final piece of evidence the prosecution presented was perhaps the most damaging. Excerpts from Marcus's journal read aloud in court. Brennan stood before the jury and read Marcus's own words, written in his neat handwriting just 10 days before the murder. I've decided who my subject will be. The pregnant woman 3 streets over. She's perfect, trusting, physically vulnerable, always alone in the evenings. I've watched her routine for 2 weeks now. She gets home from work at 5:30, makes dinner around 6:30, and spends the evening alone watching television. No husband, no roommate, no one checking on her. The pregnancy adds an interesting element to the experiment. 2 lives instead of 1, more data to observe. The clinical, detached language, referring to Emily as his subject, her murder as an experiment, her unborn child as more data, created visible revulsion on the jurors' faces. This wasn't a troubled kid acting out. This was something far darker, something that challenged every assumption about childhood innocence. When Brennan finished reading and sat down, the prosecution rested its case. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and deeply disturbing. Now it was the defense's turn to try to salvage something from the wreckage. Catherine Walsh knew she faced a nearly impossible task. Her client had confessed in vivid detail. The evidence was overwhelming. The psychological evaluations painted a disturbing picture of a young mind seemingly devoid of empathy. But she'd spent her entire career fighting for children in the justice system, and she wasn't about to abandon that principle now, even for a client as challenging as Marcus Cole. Her strategy couldn't be to prove innocence. That ship had sailed the moment Marcus opened his mouth in that interrogation room. Instead, she had to convince the jury that despite the horror of his crime, Marcus was still a child who deserved a chance at rehabilitation rather than being discarded for life. She began her defense by calling Dr. Patricia Newman, a developmental psychologist who'd worked with juvenile offenders for 30 years. Dr. Newman had a gentle demeanor but spoke with authority earned through decades of experience. Walsh guided her through testimony designed to humanize Marcus Marcus and contextualize his actions within the framework of adolescent development. Dr. Newman, you've reviewed all the evidence in this case, including Marcus Cole's journal entries, his confession, and the psychological evaluations. Can you help the jury understand how a 14-year-old arrives at the point where he's capable of what Marcus did? Dr. Newman adjusted her glasses and spoke directly to the jury. What we're seeing with Marcus is an extreme case, certainly, but it illustrates a crucial truth about adolescent development. Teenagers, particularly young teenagers, are neurologically incapable of fully grasping the permanence and weight of their actions. Their brains are flooded with dopamine, which drives sensation-seeking behavior, while the regulatory systems that would normally pump the brakes on dangerous impulses are still under construction. Think of it like giving someone a sports car with no brakes and expecting them to drive safely. She paused to let the metaphor sink in. Marcus's planning and intelligence actually make this worse, not better. Smart adolescents are particularly dangerous because they have the cognitive capacity to plan complex actions but lack the emotional maturity to understand why they shouldn't. It's like having the mind of an adult engineer but the moral reasoning of a much younger child. Walsh asked her next critical question. Dr. Newman, is Marcus beyond help? Is he, as the prosecution suggests, irredeemable? Dr. Newman shook her head firmly. No child is beyond help. Marcus's brain will continue developing until he's in his mid-20s. The neural pathways for empathy, for emotional connection, for moral reasoning, all of these can still develop with appropriate intervention. I've personally worked with dozens of young people who committed terrible crimes and went on to become productive, non-violent adults after receiving intensive therapy and age-appropriate rehabilitation. The key word is appropriate. If we throw Marcus into an adult prison where he receives no specialized treatment, where he's surrounded by hardened adult criminals, where his identity becomes permanently fixed as a monster, then yes, he probably won't change. But if he receives intensive psychological treatment, if he's given space to develop the parts of his brain that are currently underdeveloped, there's genuine hope for transformation. The jury listened carefully, some members seeming to consider her words while others appeared skeptical. During cross-examination, District Attorney Brennan approached Dr. Newman with barely concealed skepticism. Dr. Newman, you talk about rehabilitation and hope, which sounds wonderful in theory, but let me ask you directly, have you personally ever treated someone with Marcus Cole's specific psychological profile? Someone diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features at age 14? Dr. Newman hesitated. The specific combination is rare, but I've worked with young people exhibiting similar traits. Brennan pressed harder. That's not what I asked. Have you successfully rehabilitated someone with this exact profile? Someone who planned and executed a murder with this level of premeditation and showed this degree of absence of remorse? Dr. Newman had to admit, not with this exact combination, no. Brennan let that answer hang in the air before continuing. Isn't it true that the research on treating severe antisocial personality disorder, even with intensive intervention, shows success rates below 20%? Dr. Newman nodded reluctantly. The research does show limited success, yes. But that's partly because most offenders with these traits don't receive appropriate early intervention. If we catch them young enough, Brennan cut her off. Doctor, we're not talking about theory or optimal conditions. We're talking about Marcus Cole specifically. Based on everything you know about him, can you guarantee this jury that he won't kill again if given the opportunity? The question hung heavy in the courtroom. Dr. Newman couldn't answer affirmatively, and everyone knew it. I can't guarantee anyone's future behavior, she finally said, but I believe Marcus deserves the chance. Brennan interrupted again. So your answer is no. You cannot guarantee the safety of society if Marcus Cole is ever released. Thank you, Doctor. No further questions. The exchange had effectively undermined Dr. Newman's optimistic testimony, forcing her to admit the uncomfortable truth that rehabilitating Marcus was far from certain. Walsh knew she needed to shift the jury's focus, so her next witness was Diana Cole herself. This was a risky move. Diana was emotionally fragile, and her testimony could backfire if she appeared to be making excuses for her son. But Walsh believed that showing the jury a grieving mother might trigger some sympathy for Marcus by extension. Diana took the stand looking like a ghost of her former self. Her hands trembled as she was sworn in, and her voice was barely audible when she first spoke. Walsh approached gently. Mrs. Cole, I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need you to tell the jury about Marcus as a child. Before all of this happened, who was your son? Diana wiped tears from her eyes and struggled to compose herself. Marcus was a quiet baby. He didn't cry much, didn't demand attention. As he got older, he was always reading, always curious about how things worked. He taught himself to read when he was 4. By the time he started school, he was already ahead of his classmates. Teachers always said he was gifted. She paused, her voice breaking. I thought I was lucky to have such an easy child, such a smart child. I worked 2 jobs, and Marcus never complained. He did his homework, got perfect grades, never got in trouble. I thought I was doing everything right. I thought we were okay, Walsh continued carefully. Mrs. Cole, did you ever see signs that Marcus might be capable of violence? Diana shook her head adamantly. Never. He was gentle. He never hurt anyone, never even raised his voice. If I'd seen anything, any warning sign at all, I would have gotten him help. I would have done something. But he just seemed like a quiet, studious kid who preferred books to people. How was I supposed to know? The raw pain in her voice was palpable. Looking back now, I wonder if his isolation should have worried me more. I wonder if I should have forced him to make friends, to be more social. But he always said he was fine, that he didn't need anyone else. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him. What mother wants to think her child is broken? The courtroom was silent, except for Diana's quiet sobs. Walsh let the moment breathe before asking her final question. Mrs. Cole, do you believe your son can change? Diana looked directly at Marcus, who sat at the defense table staring at his hands, showing no reaction to his mother's testimony. He's my son, Diana whispered. I have to believe he can change. I have to believe there's still something good in him, something worth saving. Because if there's not, then what does that make me? What kind of mother raises a monster? The emotional impact of Diana's testimony was significant, and Walsh could see several jurors dabbing at their eyes. But during cross-examination, Brennan gently but firmly dismantled any sympathy her testimony might have generated. Mrs. Cole, I can't imagine what you're going through, and I don't mean to add to your pain, but I need to ask you something important. You testified that Marcus never showed signs of violence, but isn't it true that you worked 2 jobs and were often not home during the evenings and nights when Marcus was alone in his room, on his computer, writing in his journal? Diana had to nod. Yes, I worked a lot. I had to support us, Brennan continued, his tone sympathetic but pointed. So while you didn't see signs of violence, isn't it possible that's because you simply weren't there to see them? That Marcus was very good at hiding his true thoughts and feelings from you? Diana's face crumbled. I did my best, she whispered. I know you did, Brennan said softly, but your best, through no fault of your own, wasn't enough to prevent what happened. And hoping that Marcus can change doesn't make it true, does it? Diana couldn't answer, dissolving into tears as the judge called for a brief recess. Walsh's final witnesses were former juvenile offenders who'd been tried as adults, served their time, and successfully rehabilitated themselves. These witnesses were meant to demonstrate that even young people who committed serious crimes could change and become productive members of society. A 32-year-old man named James Patterson took the stand and described how he'd killed another teenager in a fight when he was 16, served 12 years in juvenile and adult facilities, and was now working as a counselor for at-risk youth. I was angry, violent, and completely out of control when I was 16, James testified, but I received therapy, education, and people who believed I could be more than the worst thing I'd ever done. Today, I work with kids who are heading down the same path I was on, and I've helped dozens of them turn their lives around. If I'd been given up on, sentenced to die in prison, none of that would have happened. His testimony was powerful and redemptive, but on cross-examination, Brennan quickly drew a crucial distinction. Mr. Patterson, your crime was committed in the heat of the moment during a fight, correct? James nodded. It wasn't premeditated murder? James had to admit. No, it wasn't planned. Brennan drove the point home. So, your situation, a fight that escalated into tragedy, is fundamentally different from someone who spent months planning to murder a stranger, who selected a vulnerable victim, who executed that plan with precision, and who showed no remorse afterward. Wouldn't you agree that those are very different psychological profiles? James hesitated before responding. I mean, every case is different, but Brennan didn't let him finish. Mr. Patterson, have you ever, in all your years working with troubled youth, encountered someone like Marcus Cole, someone whose crime was this premeditated and who demonstrated this level of detachment from human life? James had to answer honestly. No, I haven't encountered anyone quite like that. The admission hung in the air, effectively neutralizing the hopeful message his testimony was meant to convey. Walsh tried to recover with redirect examination, but the damage was done. The jury jury had heard that even a successfully rehabilitated former violent offender had never encountered someone with Marcus's particular brand of coldness. When the defense rested its case, Walsh had done everything she could within the constraints of an impossible situation. She'd presented scientific evidence about adolescent brain development. She'd called experts who spoke about the possibility of rehabilitation. She'd shown the jury Marcus's grieving mother and former offenders who'd turned their lives around. But none of it could erase the central, devastating facts. Marcus had methodically planned and executed a brutal murder, had shown no remorse, and exhibited psychological traits that suggested he lacked the fundamental capacity for empathy that most humans possessed. The prosecution had successfully painted a picture of a young predator who understood exactly what he was doing, while the defense had struggled to convince anyone that Marcus was redeemable. As both sides prepared their closing arguments, the entire courtroom understood that the jury faced an agonizing decision. How do you balance the scientific reality that teenage brains aren't fully developed against the moral reality that Marcus Cole had taken 2 innocent lives with cold calculation? There were no easy answers, only difficult choices with profound consequences. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as both legal teams prepared to deliver their final statements. This was the moment where everything came together. All the testimony, all the evidence, all the emotional weight of a case that had gripped the entire community. District Attorney Michael Brennan stood first, his expression grave as he approached the jury box. He'd spent 3 decades prosecuting criminals, and he knew that closing arguments weren't just about summarizing facts. They were about telling a story that made sense, that aligned with the jury's sense of justice and morality. He took a deep breath and began. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 2 weeks you've heard testimony that I'm sure has disturbed you deeply. You've seen the crime scene photographs, you've heard the medical examiner describe Emily Carson's final moments, you've watched Marcus Cole's confession video where he casually described murdering a pregnant woman like he was discussing a homework assignment. And through all of it, I know you've been asking yourselves the same question I've been asking: how is this possible? How does a 14-year-old become capable of such calculated evil? Brennan paused, making eye contact with each juror. The defense wants you to believe that Marcus is just a child whose brain isn't fully developed, who acted without understanding the consequences, who deserves mercy because of his age. But everything you've seen and heard contradicts that narrative. Marcus's brain may not be fully developed, but it was developed enough to plan a murder over the course of months. It was developed enough to study forensic science so he could avoid detection. It was developed enough to select a vulnerable victim and execute his plan with precision. And it was certainly developed enough to understand that killing is wrong. He wrote in his own journal that he knew murder was illegal and immoral. He just didn't care. The prosecutor's voice grew stronger, more passionate. The defense showed you brain scans and talked about the prefrontal cortex and neural plasticity. All of that science is real and important, but it applies to normal teenagers making impulsive mistakes. Marcus Cole isn't a normal teenager. He's not the kid who shoplifts on a dare or gets into a fight at school. He's someone who spent 6 months fantasizing about killing, who methodically planned every detail, who selected his victim like a hunter selecting prey. Brennan walked over to the evidence table and picked up Marcus's journal, holding it up for the jury to see. This journal is the roadmap of a mind that's not impulsive or confused. It's calculating and deliberate. Listen to what Marcus wrote just 2 weeks before the murder. He opened to a marked page and read aloud. The key is selecting the right subject, someone who won't perceive me as a threat, who will let me get close. Pregnant women are ideal because they're physically compromised and their protective instincts might make them more trusting of a child in apparent distress. The pregnancy also provides additional research value. Research value. Those are Marcus's words describing an unborn baby. Not a human life, not a future person with hopes and dreams, but research value. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and one woman visibly shuddered. Brennan continued, his voice rising with controlled anger. Emily Carson opened her door to Marcus because she saw a young person who appeared to need help. She invited him into her home because she was kind and trusting, and Marcus repaid that kindness by stabbing her 11 times while she begged for her life. The prosecutor's voice softened as he shifted gears. I want to talk about Emily for a moment because in all this discussion about Marcus's age and brain development, we can't forget the real victim here. Emily was 24 years old. She was 7 months pregnant with a daughter she'd already named Lily. She worked as a teacher's aide at the local elementary school, where children loved her. She volunteered at a food bank on weekends. She was saving money to buy a house with a yard where Lily could play. She had plans, dreams, a future full of possibility, and all of that was stolen by Marcus Cole, not in a moment of rage or passion, but as a calculated experiment to satisfy his curiosity about death. Brennan pulled out a photograph of Emily, the same one he'd shown during opening statements, and held it up for the jury. This woman trusted a child, and that child murdered her. This woman was carrying new life inside her, and that child destroyed it. Now the defense wants you to trust that same child, to believe that he can be rehabilitated, that he deserves mercy. But I ask you, did Marcus show Emily mercy? Did he show her unborn daughter mercy? Brennan returned to stand directly before the jury, his expression intense. The defense presented experts who talked about the possibility of change, about brain plasticity and rehabilitation, but they couldn't answer the most important question. Can Marcus Cole actually be rehabilitated? Dr. Newman admitted she'd never successfully treated anyone with his specific psychological profile. The neuropsychologist admitted that most research on juvenile offenders deals with impulsive crimes, not premeditated murders. Even the successfully rehabilitated former offender testified that he'd never encountered anyone like Marcus in all his years of working with troubled youth. Hope is not a strategy, possibility is not probability, and we cannot gamble with public safety based on optimistic theories that have never been proven with someone like Marcus. He let that sink in before continuing. Dr. Rodriguez, the forensic psychologist who evaluated Marcus, was very clear in her testimony. Marcus lacks the capacity for genuine empathy. He understands intellectually that other people have feelings, but he doesn't care. Other humans are objects to him, not real people who matter, and that's not going to change just because he gets older. The prosecutor's tone became more urgent. Ladies and gentlemen, you have a responsibility not just to Emily Carson and her unborn daughter, but to every potential future victim. Because make no mistake, if Marcus is given any chance to harm again, he will. This isn't prejudice or speculation. It's based on his own words, his own actions, and expert psychological testimony. Marcus told us himself that he wanted to experience what killing felt like. He satisfied that curiosity once, but what happens in 10 years, 20 years, if he's released? Does anyone in this courtroom truly believe he won't kill again? Brennan shook his head slowly. The defense asked you to show Marcus mercy because he's 14 years old. But mercy must be balanced with justice and public safety. Emily Carson was shown no mercy, her daughter was shown no mercy, and the next potential victim, whoever that might be if Marcus is ever free, deserves protection, not to be sacrificed on the altar of optimistic rehabilitation theories that have never been proven effective for someone with his psychological makeup. Brennan moved toward his conclusion, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. This case is not about revenge. It's not about anger or hatred toward a child. It's about justice, accountability, and recognizing that some actions are so terrible, so calculated, so devoid of basic human empathy, that they demand the most serious consequences our legal system can impose. Marcus Cole planned and executed a double murder. He showed no remorse. He demonstrated psychological characteristics that multiple experts agree make him extremely dangerous and highly unlikely to change. Your duty is clear. Find Marcus Cole guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and recommend that he be sentenced as an adult to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's the only sentence that honors Emily's memory, protects society, and acknowledges the true nature of what Marcus did. Thank you. Brennan returned to his seat, and the courtroom remained silent, the power of his words still hanging in the air. After a brief recess, Catherine Walsh stood to deliver the defense's closing argument. She knew she was fighting an uphill battle, but she dedicated her career to defending the proposition that children were different from adults, that they deserved protection and second chances. She wouldn't abandon that principle now. Walsh approached the jury with a different energy than Brennan, less theatrical, more personal and conversational. Members of the jury, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that what Marcus Cole did wasn't terrible. It was. Emily Carson's death was a tragedy that never should have happened. A baby who should have lived never got that chance. These are facts we don't dispute, and I'm not asking you to minimize or excuse them. She paused, letting her acknowledgement of the horror register. But I am asking you to remember something fundamental about our justice system. We don't just punish crimes. We consider the person who committed the crime. And Marcus Cole is not an adult. He's a child. Not legally, not neurologically, not developmentally. Walsh pulled out large poster boards showing the brain scan comparisons Dr. Brennan had presented. The science is clear and undeniable. A 14-year-old's brain is fundamentally different from an adult's brain. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse, control, understanding consequences, and moral reasoning, isn't fully developed. This isn't a theory or an excuse. It's biological fact. fact. Courts across the country have recognized this reality. The Supreme Court has ruled multiple times that children are different, that they're less culpable than adults, that they have greater capacity for change. That's why we have juvenile courts. That's why we don't execute minors. That's why we recognize that young people deserve to be treated differently. She moved closer to the jury, her expression earnest. Now the prosecution wants you to believe that Marcus is an exception to all of this science because he planned his crime. But planning doesn't erase the neurological reality. Smart teenagers can plan. They can ace tests, strategize in sports, organize complex projects. But that doesn't mean they can fully grasp the permanent, irreversible nature of death. It doesn't mean they can truly understand what it means to take a life. Walsh addressed the elephant in the room head on. I know what you're thinking. You watched that confession video. You saw Marcus's lack of emotion. You heard him describe Emily's murder with chilling detachment. And you're thinking, this kid is a monster. How can we show mercy to someone like that? But I want you to consider something. That very detachment, that lack of emotional connection, is itself evidence of his developmental immaturity. Marcus doesn't have the emotional capacity to fully process what he's done because his brain hasn't developed that capacity yet. The parts of the brain responsible for empathy, for emotional bonding, for genuine remorse, those are still forming in adolescence. They can still develop in Marcus if he receives appropriate treatment and intervention. She could see skepticism on some jurors' faces, but she pressed on. The prosecution wants you to believe that Marcus is irredeemable, that he'll never change. But that's not what the science says. Dr. Newman testified about the documented cases of young offenders who went on to live productive, nonviolent lives. The brain's plasticity during adolescence means this is actually the optimal time for intervention. Walsh picked up her own stack of papers. Research studies on juvenile rehabilitation. Studies show that young people, even those who committed serious violent crimes, have dramatically lower recidivism rates than adults when given age-appropriate rehabilitation. Why? Because their brains are still growing, still forming, still capable of developing new neural pathways. But here's the critical part. That only happens if they receive appropriate treatment. If we throw Marcus into an adult prison, surround him with hardened criminals, give him no therapy or age-appropriate programming, then yes, he probably won't change. We'll be creating the very monster the prosecution claims he already is. But if he receives intensive psychological treatment in a juvenile facility, if experts work with him as his brain continues to develop, there's genuine hope for transformation. She turned to face Marcus, who sat impassively at the defense table. Is that hope guaranteed? No. Dr. Newman couldn't guarantee it, and I won't lie to you and claim I can. But the question isn't whether rehabilitation is certain. The question is whether we as a society give up entirely on a 14-year-old child. Walsh's voice grew more passionate. The prosecution asked whether Marcus showed Emily mercy, implying that we shouldn't show him any. But that's not how justice works. We don't base our legal system on an eye for an eye. We don't lower ourselves to the level of the crime. We're better than that. We're more evolved than that. And part of being a civilized society is recognizing that children, even children who do terrible things, are not beyond redemption. She walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each member. Think about who you were at 14. Think about the mistakes you made, the poor decisions, the times your emotions overwhelmed your judgment. Now, I know most of you didn't commit murder, and I'm not suggesting that typical teenage mistakes are comparable to what Marcus did. But I am asking you to remember that 14-year-olds don't think like adults. They don't process information like adults. They don't understand consequences like adults. Every parent knows this. Every teacher knows this. Every one of us who's ever been 14 knows this. Walsh shifted her tone, becoming more somber. Marcus's mother testified about her heartbreak, about how she never saw any warning signs. Diana Cole worked 2 jobs to provide for her son. She wasn't a bad parent. She wasn't neglectful or abusive. She was a single mother doing her absolute best in difficult circumstances. And now she's living with the knowledge that her child committed an unthinkable act. But you know what else she's living with? Hope. The hope that her son can still be reached, can still develop empathy, can still become something other than the worst thing he's ever done. Is that hope foolish? Maybe. Is it the desperate prayer of a grieving mother who can't accept that her child is a monster? Probably. But it's also the same hope that our entire juvenile justice system is built on. The belief that young people can change, that their futures aren't predetermined by their pasts, that redemption is possible. She paused, letting her words resonate. The prosecution wants you to sentence a child to die in prison. Think about what that means. Marcus is 14. If you you sentence him to life without parole, he'll spend the next 70 or 80 years behind bars. He'll never attend a prom, never graduate high school, never have a meaningful relationship, never contribute anything positive to society. You'll be deciding that at age 14, his entire life story is already written and complete. Walsh moved toward her conclusion, her voice thick with emotion. I'm not asking you to forget Emily Carson. I'm not asking you to minimize what Marcus did. I'm asking you to remember that he's a child, that children are different, and that our legal system recognizes those differences for good reason. The Supreme Court has said that children are less culpable and more capable of change. Dozens of states have reformed their laws to prevent children from receiving life without parole. The civilized world looks at America's practice of sentencing juveniles to die in prison with horror and disgust. We're one of only a few countries that still does this. Is that really the company we want to keep? She returned to stand before the jury one final time. Marcus Cole committed a terrible crime. He should be held accountable. He should be incarcerated. He should receive intensive psychological treatment, but he should not be thrown away like irredeemable trash. He's 14 years old. Please, don't give up on him completely. Thank you. Walsh sat down, emotionally exhausted, knowing she'd given everything she had, but uncertain whether it would be enough to save Marcus from spending the rest of his life in prison. Judge Thornton gave the jury their instructions, carefully outlining the legal standards they needed to apply. They would deliberate on 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Emily Carson and one for her unborn daughter Lily. They would also need to decide whether Marcus should be sentenced as a juvenile or as an adult, a determination that would fundamentally shape the rest of his life. If sentenced as a juvenile, Marcus could be released when he turned 25 after receiving rehabilitation and treatment. If sentenced as an adult, he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were measured and precise, emphasizing that emotion alone couldn't guide their decision. They needed to weigh the evidence, consider the law, and reach a verdict that served justice. As the jury filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations, the tension was palpable. Everyone understood that whatever decision they reached would be controversial, would be debated, would satisfy some people while outraging others. The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, the courthouse became a focal point for protesters on both sides of the issue. Victim rights advocates held vigil outside, carrying photographs of Emily Carson and signs demanding justice. Juvenile justice reform activists stood across the street with their own signs arguing that children shouldn't be sentenced to die in prison. News crews captured it all, turning the trial into a national conversation about crime, punishment, youth, and the very nature of justice itself. Inside the courthouse, the waiting was agonizing. Emily's family gathered in a private room, unable to eat or focus on anything except the jury's deliberations. Diana Cole waited alone in a different corner of the building, isolated from everyone, praying for a verdict that would give her son any chance at redemption while knowing she had no right to hope for mercy after what he'd done. Marcus himself remained in a holding cell, reading a book, seemingly unbothered by the fact that 12 strangers were deciding whether he'd ever taste freedom again. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, spectators cramming into every available seat, reporters positioning themselves for optimal views. When everyone was assembled, Judge Thornton called for order and summoned the jury. They filed in slowly, their faces grave and exhausted. None of them looked at Marcus, which experienced court watchers knew was often a bad sign for the defendant. The foreperson, a 52-year-old accountant named Robert Chen, stood when asked if the jury had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what they'd decided. The court clerk took the verdict forms and handed them to Judge Thornton, who reviewed them silently before passing them back. "The defendant will please rise," Judge Thornton instructed. Marcus stood, his expression blank, showing no fear or anxiety. Catherine Walsh stood beside him, her hand hovering near his shoulder but not quite touching him. The clerk read the verdict aloud, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "In the matter of the state versus Marcus Daniel Cole on the charge of first-degree murder of Emily Carson, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale moved through the courtroom. Patricia Hayes gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Diana Cole let out a small, broken sound, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp. The clerk continued, "On the charge of first-degree murder of the unborn child, Lily Carson, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Marcus's expression didn't change. He simply stood there, as detached and emotionless as he'd been throughout the entire trial. Catherine Walsh's shoulders sagged slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. The clerk wasn't finished. Regarding the sentencing determination, the jury recommends that Marcus Daniel Cole be sentenced as an adult. Those last words hit like a thunderclap. Several of Emily's family members began crying, tears of relief that justice had been served, tears of grief that would never truly heal. Diana Cole collapsed forward in her seat, her body shaking with silent sobs. Judge Thornton thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Several jury members were visibly emotional, wiping tears from their eyes as they left the courtroom. This decision had clearly taken a toll on them. None of them had wanted to be responsible for deciding a child's fate, but the evidence had left them little choice. The judge scheduled a formal sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare impact statements and final arguments regarding the specific sentence to be imposed. As Marcus was led out of the courtroom by deputies, he glanced back once at his mother. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not remorse exactly, but perhaps a recognition that his life as he'd known it was over. Then the mask returned, and he was gone, escorted back to the cell where he'd await his formal sentencing. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind only the echoes of a verdict that would reverberate through the community for years to come. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Michael Brennan held a press conference flanked by Emily's family. He spoke with restrained satisfaction. Justice has been served today. Emily Carson and her unborn daughter will never be forgotten, and the person responsible for their deaths will be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. This verdict sends a clear message. Age does not excuse premeditated murder. The jury carefully considered all the evidence, including extensive testimony about adolescent brain development and rehabilitation possibilities, and they reached the only conclusion supported by the facts. Marcus Cole is guilty, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Patricia Hayes stepped up to the microphone, her voice shaking but determined. Nothing will bring my daughter back. Nothing will give Lily the life she deserved, but knowing that the person who took them from us will never have the chance to hurt another family brings some small measure of peace. Emily was kind, trusting, and full of love. She deserved so much better than what happened to her. I hope Marcus spends every day of his life in prison thinking about what he took from this world. Across the street, Catherine Walsh held her own brief statement to the press, her expression tired and sad. We respect the jury's verdict, though we're deeply disappointed by it. Marcus Cole is a child, and sentencing him to die in prison represents a failure of our justice system's ability to distinguish between youth and maturity. We plan to appeal this decision and will continue fighting for the principle that children, even children who commit terrible crimes, deserve the possibility of redemption. This case should trouble all of us, not because we minimize what Marcus did, but because we're willing to give up entirely on a 14-year-old human being. History will judge us harshly for this. She took no questions, walking away from the cameras with slumped shoulders, knowing she'd lost a battle she'd spent her career fighting. The community's reaction was mixed and passionate. Social media exploded with debate. Think pieces were published, and the case became a flashpoint in larger conversations about criminal justice reform, mental health, and society's responsibility to both victims and offenders. In the days following the verdict, several jurors spoke anonymously to reporters about their deliberations. One juror described it as the hardest decision of her life. We spent hours discussing his age, the brain science, the possibility of rehabilitation. But ultimately, we kept coming back to the evidence. Marcus planned this murder for months. He studied how to get away with it. He selected a vulnerable victim and executed his plan without mercy. Then he showed no remorse whatsoever. Every expert agreed he lacked empathy and was likely to remain dangerous. How could we risk public safety on the slim hope that he might change? Another juror expressed deep ambivalence. I have a 14-year-old son, and I kept thinking about him while we deliberated. My son makes stupid decisions all the time. That's what teenagers do. But there's a difference between stupid decisions and calculated murder. Marcus wasn't acting impulsively. He was methodical, patient, and cold. That's not typical teenage behavior. That's something else entirely, something much darker. The 2 weeks between the verdict and the sentencing hearing passed in a blur of preparation for both sides. The prosecution compiled victim impact statements from Emily's family, friends, former colleagues, and students she'd worked with at the elementary school. Each statement painted a picture of a vibrant young woman whose life had been filled with purpose and love, whose death had left a gaping hole in countless lives. Emily's mother wrote about the nursery she'd been preparing for Lily, about the grandmother dreams that would never be realized, about the suffocating grief that consumed every waking moment. Her father wrote about walking his daughter down the aisle at her wedding just 2 years earlier, about the father-daughter dances at her school events, about the unbearable pain of burying a child. Friends wrote about Emily's infectious laugh, her generosity, her excitement about becoming a mother. Students wrote crayon drawings and simple notes. Ms. Emily was nice. I miss Ms. Emily. Why did someone hurt her? The cumulative weight of these statements was devastating, a testament to a life that had mattered deeply and was mourned profoundly. The defense prepared their own materials, though Catherine Walsh knew they faced an uphill battle. She compiled letters from juvenile justice experts, neurologists, and psychologists arguing that life without parole for a 14-year-old violated international human rights standards and ignored everything science had learned about adolescent development. She included research studies showing that brain maturation continued well into a person's 20s, and that interventions with young offenders, even violent ones, showed promising results when properly implemented. She even found a few cases of juveniles who'd committed murders, received lengthy but not life sentences, and eventually been released to become productive, law-abiding adults. But she knew these materials, however compelling, might not be enough to overcome the horror of what Marcus had done and the cold, unrepentant way he'd confessed to it. The sentencing hearing would be her last chance to save Marcus from dying in prison, and the odds were stacked against her. Diana Cole spent those 2 weeks in a fog of grief and confusion. She'd lost her son, not to death, but to something perhaps worse. Marcus still existed, but the boy she'd raised, the quiet child she'd worked so hard to provide for, was gone. In his place was a stranger who'd committed unthinkable acts without remorse. She visited Marcus twice in the juvenile detention center where he was being held. During both visits, she tried to reach him, tried to find some spark of the child she'd loved. "Marcus, do you understand what's happened? Do you understand that you're going to prison for the rest of your life?" she'd asked, her voice breaking. Marcus had looked at her with those flat, emotionless eyes and responded, "I understand the consequences of being caught." Not remorse for what he'd done, just acknowledgement of the outcome. Diana realized with crushing finality that her son truly didn't feel what he should feel, didn't understand why his actions were wrong beyond the intellectual knowledge that society punished them. She left those visits feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. As the sentencing hearing approached, both legal teams knew this was the final chapter of a case that had consumed their lives for months. Brennan prepared his arguments for why Marcus deserved the maximum sentence: life without parole, to be served in adult facilities once he turned 18. Walsh prepared her plea for mercy, for some glimmer of hope that Marcus might one day prove capable of change. And Marcus himself sat in his cell, reading books on philosophy and psychology, seemingly unconcerned about the fate that awaited him. The stage was set for the final act, where Judge Thornton would impose a sentence that would define not just Marcus's future, but also send a message about how society valued rehabilitation versus retribution, hope versus resignation, and whether a 14-year-old could truly be beyond redemption. The courtroom would soon fill once again, and this time there would be no jury to share the burden of decision. The judge alone would determine whether Marcus Cole would ever again know freedom, and that decision would echo far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The morning of the sentencing hearing arrived cold and gray, matching the somber mood inside the courthouse. The gallery was packed once again, though this time the atmosphere felt different, heavier, more final. There would be no more witnesses, no more cross-examinations, no more legal maneuvering. Today was about giving voice to the pain Marcus had caused and determining what justice would look like. Judge Thornton entered promptly at 9 a.m., her expression grave as she surveyed the packed courtroom. She understood the weight of the decision before her. This wasn't just about Marcus Cole, it was about setting precedent, about sending a message regarding how society treated juvenile offenders who committed adult crimes. She called the court to order and announced that they would begin with victim impact statements. Patricia Hayes would speak first. Emily's mother stood slowly, clutching a photograph of her daughter, and made her way to the podium. Her hands trembled as she placed her prepared statement on the lectern, but when she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong, powered by grief that had transformed into steely determination. "Your Honor, my name is Patricia Hayes, and I'm here to speak for my daughter Emily, who can no longer speak for herself. I'm here to speak for my granddaughter Lily, who never got the chance to speak at all." Patricia's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed forward. "Emily was my only child. She was the light of my life from the moment she was born. She was kind, patient, and saw the good in everyone. When she told me she was pregnant, I saw pure joy in her eyes. She was going to be an amazing mother. I had no doubt about that. She'd already picked out a name, decorated a nursery, read every parenting book she could find. She talked to Lily every night, telling her about all the things they'd do together, all the places they'd go, all the love she had waiting." Tears streamed down Patricia's face now, but she didn't wipe them away. That future was stolen by the person sitting at that table. Marcus Cole knocked on my daughter's door, and she opened it because she was kind, because she believed in helping others, because she couldn't imagine that a child would hurt her. And that kindness cost her everything. Patricia's voice grew harder, angrier. "I've sat through this entire trial listening to people talk about Marcus's age, his brain development, his potential for change. But nobody talks about Emily's potential. Nobody talks about what Lily might have become. My daughter will never turn 25. She'll never see her baby take her first steps or hear her say mama. Lily will never have a first day of school, never blow out birthday candles, never exist at all beyond the few months she spent in Emily's womb. Their potential ended when Marcus decided their lives meant less than his curiosity about killing." She paused, composing herself before continuing. "I don't care that Marcus is 14. I don't care that his brain isn't fully developed. He was developed enough to plan this murder for months. He was developed enough to study how to avoid getting caught. He was developed enough to look my daughter in the eye and stab her 11 times while she begged for mercy. Age doesn't erase those choices. It doesn't bring back the people he murdered." Patricia looked directly at Marcus, her eyes burning with grief and rage. "You took everything from me. You destroyed my family. You killed my daughter and my granddaughter without a second thought, and you've never once said you're sorry. Not once have I seen any sign that you understand the magnitude of what you've done. You sit there looking bored like this is all just an inconvenience, like the lives you destroyed don't matter. Well, they do matter. Emily mattered. Lily mattered, and I'm begging this court to make sure you never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else ever again." She turned back to Judge Thornton, her voice breaking. "Please, Your Honor, give Marcus Cole the maximum sentence. Life in prison without parole. It's the only way to ensure he can never do this again. It's the only justice Emily and Lily will ever receive. Thank you." Patricia returned to her seat, collapsing into her husband's arms, her body shaking with sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jury members who'd returned to watch the sentencing were openly crying. Emily's father, Robert Hayes, spoke next. He was a man of few words normally, a retired construction worker who preferred action to speeches. But today he had things that needed saying. "I walked my daughter down the aisle at her wedding 2 years ago. It was one of the proudest days of my life. Emily was so beautiful, so happy. I remember thinking that I'd done my job as a father. I'd raised a good person who would go on to have a good life. I was wrong. I couldn't protect her." His voice was thick with pain. "The person who killed my daughter is sitting right there. He's 14 years old. People keep saying that like it means something, like it should make us feel sorry for him. But you know what I see when I look at Marcus Cole? I see someone who's bigger than Emily was, stronger than Emily was, old enough to know that stabbing someone 11 times will kill them, old enough to plan and execute murder. If he's old enough to do that, he's old enough to face the consequences. Robert's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I served in the military. I've seen violence, seen people do terrible things in war zones. But at least there, people had reasons, survival, orders, fear. What reason did Marcus have? Curiosity. He wanted to know what it felt like to kill. That's not a reason. That's not an excuse. That's just evil. He took a shaky breath. Emily's gone. My granddaughter's gone. My wife barely sleeps anymore. I wake up every morning and forget for just a second that Emily's dead, and then I remember. And it's like losing her all over again. That's my life now, every single day, because a 14-year-old decided murder would be an interesting experience. So yes, Your Honor, I want the maximum sentence. I want Marcus Cole to spend every day of his life in prison, just like we'll spend every day of ours grieving what he took from us. That's justice. Robert sat down heavily, exhausted by the emotional toll of speaking, his face carved with permanent lines of sorrow. Several of Emily's friends spoke next, each adding their own perspective on the woman Marcus had killed. Her college roommate described Emily's infectious laugh and generous spirit. A fellow teacher talked about how Emily would stay late to help struggling students, never considering it an inconvenience but rather a privilege. A childhood friend shared memories of growing up together, of sleepovers and secrets and dreams they'd made. Each statement painted a fuller picture of the life that had been stolen, the relationships that had been shattered, the futures that would never be realized. By the time the victim impact statements concluded, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The cumulative weight of grief was crushing, and even Judge Thornton had to pause to compose herself before moving forward. Marcus sat through all of it with the same blank expression he'd maintained throughout the trial. If the testimonies affected him at all, he gave no sign. He simply stared straight ahead, occasionally glancing at the clock as if counting down until this ordeal would be over. When Judge Thornton asked if the defense had any statements to present, Catherine Walsh stood and called Diana Cole to the podium. Diana looked like she'd aged 20 years since the trial began. Her hair was streaked with gray that hadn't been there before, her face was gaunt, and her eyes held a hollowness that spoke to a grief almost beyond comprehension. When she began to speak, her voice was barely audible, and the judge had to ask her to speak up. Your Honor, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. I'm Marcus's mother, but I'm also a human being who's horrified by what he did. I can't defend his actions. I can't make excuses for him. What he did to Emily Carson and her baby is unforgivable. Diana's hands shook as she gripped the podium for support. But he's still my son. I carried him for 9 months. I raised him alone, worked 2 jobs to give him opportunities. I loved him with everything I had. And I failed. I don't know how, but I failed to see what was growing inside him. I failed to protect him from himself, and I failed to protect Emily from him. Tears streamed down Diana's face as she continued. I've asked myself 1,000 times what I could have done differently. Should I have worked less and been home more? Should I have forced him into therapy when I noticed how isolated he was? Should I have somehow sensed that something was terribly wrong? I'll never know the answers to those questions, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. She looked over at Marcus, her expression a mixture of love and incomprehension. When I look at my son now, I don't recognize him. The boy I raised wouldn't hurt anyone. But that boy was apparently a stranger to me, or maybe he never existed at all. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that Marcus is 14 years old. His life isn't over yet. His brain is still developing. There's still a chance, maybe a small one, but still a chance, that he could change, could develop the empathy he lacks now, could become something other than a murderer. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I'm not asking you to show mercy because he deserves it. I'm asking you to show mercy because he's a child, and children are supposed to get second chances. Even if nobody else believes in that possibility, I have to. Because he's my son, and I can't give up on him completely, even though I know I probably should. Diana's final words were almost inaudible. Whatever you decide, Your Honor, I understand. Emily's family deserves justice. The community deserves protection. And Marcus deserves consequences for what he's done. I just hope that somewhere in those consequences, there's room for the possibility that a 14-year-old might still be capable of change. Thank you. She stumbled back to her seat, broken and defeated, having offered the only thing she had left. A mother's desperate hope in the face of overwhelming evidence that her son was beyond redemption. The courtroom remained silent, processing the impossible position Diana found herself in, loving a child who'd committed an unforgivable act, unable to defend him, but unable to abandon him completely. Judge Thornton gave everyone a moment to collect themselves before moving to the next phase of the hearing. The emotional testimony had been draining for everyone present, but the hardest part was still to come, the final arguments about sentencing and the judge's ultimate decision. Catherine Walsh stood to make her final plea for leniency. She knew the odds were against her, knew that the victim impact statements had been powerful and moving, knew that every instinct in that courtroom was crying out for punishment, but she had to try. Your Honor, the pain expressed by Emily Carson's family is real and valid. Nothing I say is meant to diminish their suffering or minimize what Marcus did. But I ask you to consider what kind of society we want to be. Do we want to be a society that gives up on children? That says a 14-year-old is irredeemable? That believes a young person's entire future should be determined by their worst moment? She presented her research on juvenile brain development, on successful rehabilitation programs, on the international condemnation of life without parole for juveniles. Your Honor, you have the opportunity to choose justice over vengeance, hope over despair, rehabilitation over pure punishment. I'm asking you to sentence Marcus to juvenile detention with the possibility of transfer to adult facilities if he doesn't respond to treatment. Give him a chance to prove he can change. If he fails, then he remains incarcerated, but at least give him that chance. Please. District Attorney Brennan stood for his rebuttal, his expression stern. Your Honor, the defense wants you to believe this is about hope versus despair. It's not. It's about accountability and public safety. Marcus Cole committed a calculated, premeditated double murder. He's shown no remorse. Every psychological evaluation indicates he's likely to remain dangerous. The possibility of rehabilitation is theoretical at best, contradicted by most research on offenders with his psychological profile. This court's responsibility is to protect society and deliver justice for victims. The only sentence that accomplishes both goals is life without parole. Marcus Cole made his choices. Now he must face the consequences. The arguments concluded, and Judge Thornton announced she would take a brief recess before delivering her sentence. The weight of the decision was visible on her face as she left the bench. When she returned 30 minutes later, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. The moment of final judgment had arrived. Judge Margaret Thornton settled into her seat, the weight of 3 decades on the bench evident in every line of her weathered face. She'd presided over countless cases, domestic disputes, drug offenses, robberies, even several murders. But none had challenged her quite like this one. Before her sat a 14-year-old boy who'd methodically planned and executed a brutal double homicide, showing no remorse whatsoever. Behind her stretched the accumulated wisdom of law, precedent, and society's evolving understanding of juvenile culpability, and in her hands rested the power to decide whether Marcus Cole would ever again know freedom. The courtroom held its collective breath as she shuffled the papers before her, composing her thoughts for what she knew would be one of the most important decisions of her career. When she finally looked up, her expression was grave but resolute. She knew her words would be scrutinized, debated, and possibly appealed, but she also knew what justice demanded in this particular case. "Marcus Daniel Cole, please rise," Judge Thornton said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. Marcus stood, his posture straight, his expression blank. Catherine Walsh stood beside him, her hand hovering protectively near his shoulder. This court has heard extensive testimony over the past several weeks. We've heard from forensic experts, psychologists, law enforcement, and most importantly, from those whose lives were forever shattered by your actions. Before I impose sentence, I want to address several points that have been raised throughout these proceedings. Judge Thornton paused, making direct eye contact with Marcus. The defense has argued passionately that you are a child, that your brain isn't fully developed, that you deserve the possibility of rehabilitation. These arguments are not without merit. Science has indeed shown us that adolescent brains function differently from adult brains, that the capacity for judgment and impulse control continues to develop well into a person's 20s. Our legal system has recognized this reality in numerous ways, and I take these findings seriously. The judge's expression hardened slightly. However, the defense's arguments assume that all juvenile crimes are created equal, that we should treat a 14-year-old who commits premeditated murder the same way we treat a 14-year-old who shoplifts or gets into a fight. The evidence in this case demonstrates conclusively that such an assumption would be a grave error. She picked up Marcus's journal, holding it up for everyone to see. This journal documents months of planning, research, and preparation. You didn't act on impulse, Marcus. You didn't make a split-second decision in the heat of passion. You methodically studied how to commit murder and avoid detection. You selected your victim based on her vulnerability. You executed your plan with cold precision, and when confronted with what you'd done, you showed no remorse, no guilt, no recognition that you'd destroyed innocent lives. Instead, you described Emily Carson's murder as an experiment, her unborn child as additional research value. Judge Thornton's voice grew stronger, more forceful. The defense argues that your lack of empathy is itself evidence of developmental immaturity. But Dr. Rodriguez's evaluation paints a much darker picture of a mind that may be fundamentally incapable of genuine empathy, not because of age, but because of personality structure. Judge Thornton set down the journal and picked up the victim impact statements. I've read every word spoken by Emily Carson's family. I've seen their pain, their grief, their justified anger. Emily was 24 years old. She was preparing to become a mother. She opened her door to you with kindness and trust, and you repaid that kindness with violence beyond comprehension. You took not one life but two, Emily and her unborn daughter Lily. You robbed a family of their daughter, their granddaughter, their future. The magnitude of your crime cannot be overstated. The courtroom remained deathly silent, everyone hanging on the judge's every word. The defense has also argued that sentencing you to life without parole makes us a society that has given up on children. But Marcus, you're not just any child. Multiple experts have evaluated you and reached disturbing conclusions about your psychological makeup. You exhibit traits of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features. You lack the capacity for genuine empathy. You view other human beings as objects rather than people with inherent worth and dignity. Judge Thornton leaned forward, her gaze intense. The question before this court is not whether 14-year-olds generally deserve second chances. The question is whether you specifically have demonstrated any capacity or desire to change. And the answer, based on all available evidence, is no. You've shown no remorse. You've expressed no desire for rehabilitation. During your psychological evaluations, you made it clear that you don't see anything wrong with what you did beyond the inconvenience of being caught. You told Detective Martinez that empathy is overrated, that it makes people weak. Those aren't the words of a child who made a terrible mistake and wants to make amends. Those are the words of someone who fundamentally doesn't value human life. The judge paused, allowing her words to sink in. The defense presented research showing that some juvenile offenders successfully rehabilitate and become productive members of society. But even their own expert, Dr. Newman, admitted she'd never successfully treated anyone with your specific psychological profile. Even the reformed offender who testified had never encountered someone quite like you. Judge Thornton's voice grew quieter, but more intense. This court has a responsibility not just to you, Marcus, but to society as a whole. We must balance the possibility, however remote, that you might change against the very real danger you pose to others. Dr. Rodriguez testified that you represent an extreme risk for future violence. Every piece of evidence supports that conclusion. Your journal makes clear that you found Emily's murder satisfying, that you enjoyed the power you felt. What happens in 10 years, 20 years if you're released? Does this court simply hope you've developed empathy in the meantime? Do we cross our fingers and pray that your next curiosity doesn't involve taking another life? She shook her head slowly. The law demands that we protect society from those who've proven themselves dangerous. You've not only proven yourself dangerous, you've proven yourself to be methodically, calculatingly, remorselessly dangerous. The kind of danger that plans for months before striking. The kind that selects vulnerable victims. The kind that shows no conscience afterward. The judge straightened in her chair, her decision clearly made. Marcus Daniel Cole, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder. That jury also recommended that you be sentenced as an adult, a recommendation I find both appropriate and necessary given the nature of your crimes and your psychological profile. She paused, and everyone in the courtroom seemed to stop breathing. It is the judgment and sentence of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. You will be housed in juvenile facilities until you reach the age of 18, at which point you will be transferred to adult correctional facilities. The words fell like hammer blows. Patricia Hayes burst into tears of relief and continued grief. Diana Cole let out a wail of anguish, her worst fears realized. Marcus himself stood completely still, his expression unchanging, as if the judge had just told him his homework was due tomorrow, rather than that he'd never be free again. Judge Thornton wasn't finished. Let me be clear about why I've imposed this sentence. This is not about revenge. This is not about anger toward a child. This is about acknowledging an uncomfortable truth, that some individuals, regardless of age, are so fundamentally dangerous and so lacking in the capacity for genuine change that society cannot safely accommodate them. You are one of those individuals, Marcus. Everything about your crime, the planning, the execution, the complete absence of remorse, demonstrates that you pose an ongoing threat to anyone who might cross your path. I cannot in good conscience risk another Emily Carson, another family destroyed, another life stolen to satisfy your curiosity or need for stimulation. She continued, her voice heavy with the weight of her decision. Some will criticize this sentence, will argue that I've given up on a child, that I've violated principles of rehabilitation and hope. But hope must be grounded in reality. The reality is that you've shown no sign of wanting to change, no indication that you're capable of developing genuine empathy, no remorse for the lives you destroyed. Until and unless those things change dramatically, you remain a danger to society. Judge Thornton's final words were directed to everyone in the courtroom, not just Marcus. This case should serve as a wake-up call. We need better mental health screening for young people. We need to identify children with these dangerous personality traits before they act on them. We need intervention programs that can reach troubled youth before tragedy strikes. But once a crime of this magnitude has been committed, once 2 innocent lives have been stolen with such calculation and coldness, Our primary obligation must be to protect potential future victims. That is what this sentence does." She turned back to Marcus. "You will have access to educational programs, psychological treatment if you choose to participate, and all the resources the correctional system provides. If you ever develop genuine remorse, if you ever truly understand the gravity of what you've done, those changes will be documented. But they won't change your sentence. You will spend the rest of your life incarcerated. That is the consequence of the choices you made." Judge Thornton struck her gavel once, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a final punctuation mark. "This court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions. Emily's family embraced each other, crying tears of relief that justice had been served, though no sentence could ever truly make them whole. Juvenile justice advocates in the gallery shook their heads in disappointment, some calling out that this was a miscarriage of justice. News reporters rushed out to file their stories about a 14-year-old sentenced to die in prison, and Diana Cole sat motionless in her seat, staring at nothing, her world completely shattered. She'd lost her daughter to death, and now she'd lost her son to the justice system. 2 deputies approached Marcus to escort him out of the courtroom. As they placed handcuffs on his wrists, he turned back one final time to look at his mother. For just a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not remorse, but perhaps a recognition of finality and understanding that this was goodbye to the life he'd known. Diana reached out toward him, but she was too far away to touch. And then he was gone, led through the side door toward a future that would be spent entirely behind bars. Catherine Walsh gathered her papers with shaking hands, devastated by the outcome but not entirely surprised. She'd known from the beginning that saving Marcus was nearly impossible given the evidence against him. Still, the finality of the sentence hit hard. She'd spent her entire career believing that no child was beyond redemption, and now a judge had essentially ruled that Marcus Cole was exactly that. Beyond redemption, beyond hope, beyond the reach of the justice system's rehabilitative ideals. She'd file appeals, as was her duty, but she held little hope they'd succeed. District Attorney Brennan shook hands with Emily's family, his expression one of somber satisfaction. Justice had been served, but there was no joy in it. The victory felt hollow because it couldn't undo the tragedy that had brought them all to this courtroom. Emily and Lily were still gone. Marcus's life was still effectively over. Everyone involved had lost something precious, and no sentence could restore what had been taken. Outside the courthouse, 2 very different press conferences unfolded simultaneously. On one side, Brennan stood with the Hayes family, addressing reporters about the importance of the sentence. "Today's ruling sends a clear message that age does not excuse premeditated murder. Marcus Cole made choices, and those choices have consequences. Emily Carson's family can finally begin the long process of healing, knowing that the person who destroyed their lives will never have the opportunity to hurt another family." Patricia Hayes spoke briefly, her voice steady despite her tears. "Nothing will bring Emily and Lily back, but knowing that Marcus will never walk free brings some small measure of peace. Emily believed in justice, and today justice was served." On the other side of the building, advocacy groups held their own press conference condemning the sentence as barbaric and counterproductive. A representative from the Juvenile Justice Coalition spoke passionately about how America was one of the only countries that sentenced children to life without parole, how such sentences violated international human rights standards, how they contradicted everything science had learned about adolescent development. The debate would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. Legal scholars would write articles analyzing the case. Neuroscientists would cite it in discussions about juvenile culpability. Victim rights advocates would point to it as an example of appropriate consequences for heinous crimes. Reform advocates would hold it up as evidence of a broken system that had given up on children. The case of Marcus Cole would become a touchstone in ongoing debates about crime, punishment, youth, and the nature of justice itself. But for those directly involved, Emily's grieving family, Diana's shattered existence, and Marcus himself beginning his journey into a prison system he'd never leave, the debates were abstract. The reality was concrete and unchanging. 2 lives had been stolen. 1 life had been permanently confined, and the ripples of those events would continue spreading outward, affecting countless people who'd never met Emily Carson or Marcus Cole, but who'd hear their stories and be forced to confront difficult questions about what justice really means. As the sun set on the courthouse that evening, the building emptied slowly. Reporters packed up their equipment, protesters dispersed to their homes. The marble halls that had hosted so much emotion and testimony fell silent once again. In the holding cells beneath the courthouse, Marcus sat alone, staring at the wall, beginning to process what the rest of his life would look like. He'd spend the next 4 years in juvenile detention facilities designed for young offenders, surrounded by counselors and education programs and treatment options he'd likely ignore. Then, on his 18th birthday, he'd be transferred to adult prisons where he'd spend the next 60 or 70 years, growing old behind bars, his intelligence and potential channeled into nothing, his life measured in decades of confinement. Whether he'd ever develop genuine remorse, whether his brain would eventually form the empathetic connections it currently lacked, whether he'd spend his imprisonment regretting his choices or simply resenting getting caught, no one could say. The only certainty was that he'd never be free to hurt anyone else, and for Emily Carson's family, for the community of Millbrook, for a society struggling to balance mercy with protection, that was all that mattered. The weeks following Marcus Cole's sentencing brought a strange quietness to Millbrook, like the heavy silence that follows a storm. The news vans departed, the protesters dispersed, and the courthouse returned to its normal rhythm of routine cases and minor disputes. But for those directly touched by the tragedy, life would never return to normal. Emily Carson's memory lingered in unexpected places. The elementary school where she'd worked kept a memorial garden in her honor, students planting flowers each spring in remembrance of the teacher's aide who'd been so kind to them. The food bank where she'd volunteered established a scholarship fund in her name, helping single mothers pursue education while raising their children. These small tributes couldn't fill the void her absence created, but they offered some comfort to a family drowning in grief. Patricia and Robert Hayes struggled through each day, their home too quiet, the nursery they'd prepared for Lily remaining untouched, a shrine to dreams that would never materialize. Some days Patricia would stand in the doorway of that room, staring at the crib and tiny clothes, wondering what her granddaughter might have looked like, what her first words might have been. The Hayes family attended a grief support group for relatives of murder victims, finding some solace in connecting with others who understood the unique pain of losing loved ones to violence. But even among that community of shared suffering, their story stood out. Most group members had lost family to domestic disputes, drug-related violence, or crimes of passion. The Hayes had lost Emily and Lily to something far more incomprehensible: a teenage boy's curiosity about death, a calculated experiment with real human lives. How do you process that level of senselessness? How do you find meaning when there wasn't even rage or jealousy or greed to explain the loss? Patricia kept Emily's photo on her bedside table, talking to it each night before sleep, updating her daughter on the world she was missing. "The flowers bloomed beautifully this spring," she'd whisper. "You always loved spring." It was a one-sided conversation with someone who could never respond, but it was the only way Patricia knew to maintain connection with the daughter violence had stolen. Robert threw himself into work, taking on extra projects, staying busy from dawn until exhaustion forced him to sleep. He couldn't stand being idle because idle moments filled with memories. Emily learning to ride a bike, Emily graduating high school, Emily's wedding day when she'd looked so beautiful and happy. Those memories, once treasured, now felt like knives cutting fresh wounds each time they surfaced. He'd grown thinner, more withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. Friends and extended family worried about him, but Robert insisted he was fine, that he just needed time. Time, however, wasn't healing anything. It was simply creating distance from the last moment Emily had been alive, and that distance felt like betrayal, like he was moving forward while she remained frozen in that kitchen where Marcus had left her. The Hayes marriage strained under the weight of incompatible grieving styles. Patricia needed to talk, to process, to keep Emily's memory alive through constant remembrance. Robert needed silence, distraction, anything to avoid the crushing reality of their loss. They existed in the same house but increasingly separate worlds, two people destroyed by the same tragedy but unable to reach each other across the chasm of their pain. Diana Cole's life disintegrated completely in the aftermath of Marcus's sentencing. She lost both her jobs. One employer let her go citing necessary restructuring. The other was more honest, admitting that customers felt uncomfortable being served by the mother of a convicted murderer. Her friends, few as they'd been, stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact when she collected her mail. She became a pariah in Millbrook, the woman who'd somehow raised a monster, though no one could articulate exactly what she should have done differently. Diana spent her days in her small house, the walls closing in around her, Marcus's empty bedroom a constant reminder of catastrophic failure. She'd tried visiting him twice at the juvenile detention facility where he was being held, but the encounters left her more devastated than before. Marcus remained emotionless, discussing his daily routine with the same detachment he'd shown when describing Emily's murder. He never asked how Diana was coping. He never expressed concern for anyone but himself. During their second visit, Diana had broken down completely, begging Marcus to show some sign of humanity, some flicker of remorse or recognition that he'd destroyed multiple lives. Marcus had looked at her with those flat eyes and said, "Why are you crying? I'm the one in prison." The statement, so perfectly encapsulating his inability to see beyond himself, had shattered whatever hope Diana still harbored that her son might one day understand what he'd done. Financial pressures mounted as Diana struggled to pay bills without steady employment. The house fell into disrepair, peeling paint, overgrown lawn, broken fixtures she couldn't afford to fix. She applied for jobs, but found doors closing when employers Googled her name and discovered her connection to Marcus Cole. One particularly cruel interviewer had asked directly, "How did you not know your son was planning to commit murder?" The question, though unfair, haunted Diana. How had she not known? What signs had she missed? She replayed years of memories, searching for red flags she should have recognized. Marcus's isolation should have worried her more. His detachment should have seemed abnormal. But single mothers working multiple jobs to survive didn't have the luxury of analyzing their children's every behavior. She'd been exhausted, overwhelmed, doing her best with limited resources. Was that enough? Would anything have been enough to prevent what Marcus became? Diana would never know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her like a slow poison, eroding whatever sense of self-worth she'd once possessed. Diana eventually moved out of Millbrook, unable to bear the weight of constant judgment and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She relocated to a small apartment 2 hours away, working under the table at a convenience store owned by someone who either didn't know or didn't care about her past. The move provided some relief from immediate social pressure, but it couldn't erase her internal torment. She was Marcus's mother. That fact defined her existence now, overshadowing everything else she'd ever been or accomplished. Late at night, she'd lie awake wondering if she should have seen a psychologist herself, if professional help might offer some explanation or path toward accepting the unacceptable. But therapy cost money she didn't have, and besides, What could a therapist really say? Your son is a remorseless killer. You raised him. That's your legacy. These truths were inescapable, and no amount of counseling could change them. Diana existed in a state of suspended grief, mourning a son who was still alive but lost to her, mourning the life she'd tried to build, mourning the naive belief that love and hard work were enough to raise a good person. Meanwhile, Marcus adapted to life in juvenile detention with disturbing ease. The facility was designed for young offenders, kids who'd committed robberies, assaults, drug offenses, teenagers who'd made serious mistakes but still showed capacity for rehabilitation. Marcus stood apart from the other residents not because of the severity of his crime alone, but because of his complete lack of remorse or desire to change. Counselors assigned to work with him reported frustration at his engagement with therapy. He attended sessions because they were mandatory, answered questions with textbook responses he'd clearly researched, and demonstrated perfect understanding of what he was supposed to feel without actually feeling any of it. One therapist noted in his file, Marcus can articulate appropriate emotional responses and understands theoretically why his actions were wrong. However, this appears to be purely intellectual knowledge without corresponding emotional comprehension. He views therapy as a game where the goal is saying the right things rather than genuine self-reflection or growth. The assessment was damning but accurate. Marcus had learned to perform remorse without experiencing it, to simulate empathy without possessing it. The other residents in juvenile detention gave Marcus a wide berth. Word had spread about what he'd done, murdered a pregnant woman in cold blood, and even among young people who'd committed serious crimes, Marcus's actions stood out as particularly disturbing. Some teenagers avoided him out of fear. Others avoided him because his presence unsettled them in ways they couldn't articulate. Marcus didn't seem to mind the isolation. He spent his days reading advanced textbooks on psychology, philosophy, and criminal justice, his intelligence continuing to develop even as his emotional capacity remained frozen. He wrote letters to his mother occasionally, perfunctory updates about his daily routine that contained no affection, no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Diana received these letters like wounds, reading his neat handwriting, describing the books he was reading or the classes he was taking, desperately searching between the lines for some sign of the child she'd loved. She never found it. The boy who wrote those letters was a stranger using her son's hand. As months turned into years, Marcus approached his 18th birthday, the date when he'd be transferred from juvenile facilities to adult prisons. The staff at the detention center prepared reports documenting his time there, his participation in programs, his behavioral record. The reports were technically positive. Marcus had never been violent, never broken rules, never caused disciplinary problems. But every evaluation contained the same underlying message. Marcus poses no behavioral problems, but shows no genuine rehabilitation. He complies with requirements while demonstrating no authentic change in his psychological makeup or value system. The recommendation was unanimous. Marcus required continued maximum security confinement and ongoing psychological monitoring. Not because he caused trouble, but because the absence of trouble masked an ongoing danger. He'd learned to navigate the system, to say the right things and avoid sanctions, but nothing fundamental had changed about the mind that had planned and executed Emily Carson's murder. The therapists and counselors who'd worked with him for 4 years had failed to reach whatever humanity might exist beneath his surface compliance. If anything, Marcus had simply become better at hiding his true thoughts, more skilled at performing normalcy while remaining fundamentally disconnected from genuine human feeling. Catherine Walsh continued filing appeals on Marcus's behalf, as was her legal obligation. She challenged the life without parole sentence on constitutional grounds, arguing it violated prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment for juveniles. She cited Supreme Court precedents, neuroscience research, and international human rights standards. Each appeal was carefully crafted and passionately argued, but each was also denied. Appellate courts acknowledged the difficult balance between recognizing adolescent immaturity and responding to heinous crimes, but they ultimately upheld Judge Thornton's sentence. The reasoning was consistent across rulings. While juvenile life without parole should be rare, Marcus Cole's case represented exactly the kind of exceptional circumstances that warranted such a sentence. The premeditation, the psychological evaluations, the complete absence of remorse, and the expert assessment of ongoing danger combined to create a profile that justified the harshest available punishment. Walsh kept fighting, driven by principle more than hope, but she understood that Marcus's appeals were likely exhausted. Barring a dramatic change in constitutional law or a genuine transformation in Marcus himself that might warrant clemency decades from now, he would die in prison. The community of Millbrook slowly moved forward, though the case left permanent scars. The small suburban neighborhood where Emily had lived saw property values decline as families chose not to raise children in a place marked by such tragedy. The elementary school where Emily had worked held an annual memorial assembly, ensuring new students understood the importance of kindness and the devastating consequences of violence. Local churches incorporated discussions about youth mental health into their programming, hoping to identify troubled young people before they reached Marcus's level of dangerous detachment. These efforts represented genuine attempts to extract meaning from tragedy, to prevent future Emily Carsons from falling victim to future Marcus Coles. But everyone involved understood the uncomfortable truth. Marcus had shown no obvious warning signs that average parents, teachers, or community members could have recognized and addressed. He'd been quiet, intelligent, isolated, but not aggressively antisocial. How do you identify someone like that before they act? The question haunted Millbrook, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that no community program could fully address. Detective Sarah Martinez retired 18 months after Marcus's sentencing, the case having taken a toll that extended beyond normal professional stress. She'd investigated dozens of homicides over her career, but Marcus Cole's cold confession and complete lack of humanity had shaken something fundamental in her worldview. She'd always believed that everyone had some core of humanity, some capacity for redemption if you dug deep enough. Marcus had proven that belief naive. Some people, even some children, were simply missing whatever made the rest of humanity recoil from harming others. Martinez spent her retirement traveling, volunteering, trying to refocus on the good in the world rather than the darkness she'd spent decades confronting. But Emily's face appeared in her dreams sometimes, along with Marcus's flat, emotionless eyes. Those images would never fully leave her. They were the price of bearing witness to the worst of what humans could do to each other, and no amount of distance or time would erase them completely. The case of Marcus Cole and Emily Carson would follow everyone it touched for the rest of their lives, a permanent scar marking the moment they'd confronted evil wearing a child's face and been forced to acknowledge that sometimes, rarely but undeniably, monsters were real. Marcus Cole turned 18 in a juvenile detention facility on a Tuesday morning in April. There was no celebration, no cake, no acknowledgement that this date marked his transition into legal adulthood. Instead, it marked something far more significant: the end of his time in facilities designed for youth and the beginning of his permanent residence in the adult prison system. The transfer happened within 48 hours of his birthday. 2 corrections officers arrived to escort him from the juvenile facility where he'd spent the previous 4 years to Riverside Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison 300 miles away. Marcus packed his few belongings, books mostly, along with letters from his mother he'd never responded to with any genuine emotion, and walked out of the only home he'd known since age 14. Other residents watched his departure with a mixture of relief and curiosity. They'd lived alongside a convicted double murderer for years, and now he was leaving to join the truly dangerous adults. Some wondered if Marcus would survive in adult prison. Others wondered if the adult prisoners would survive Marcus. Riverside Correctional Institution was a world entirely different from juvenile detention. The facility housed over 2,000 inmates, many serving life sentences for murder, armed robbery, and other violent crimes. The atmosphere was harder, more predatory, filled with men who'd spent decades learning to survive in an environment where weakness was exploited and violence simmered constantly beneath the surface. Marcus arrived during intake processing, strip-searched, photographed, and issued standard prison uniforms. The guards who processed him had been briefed on his case. Youngest lifer in the state, murdered a pregnant woman at 14, showed no remorse. They watched him carefully, looking for signs of fear or vulnerability that might make him a target for the general population. They found neither. Marcus moved through intake with the same detached calm he'd displayed in the courtroom years earlier, answering questions with minimal words, his expression revealing nothing. One veteran guard remarked to his colleague, "That one's going to be trouble. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The ones who don't show fear are either incredibly stupid or incredibly dangerous." Marcus was initially placed in protective custody while prison officials determined the safest housing arrangement. Protective custody isolated him from the general population, giving staff time to assess how he'd fit into the complex social hierarchy that governed prison life. During this period, Marcus underwent additional psychological evaluations and met with the prison's mental health staff. Dr. Michael Winters, the prison psychologist assigned to his case, spent 3 sessions trying to understand the young man who'd been described in court documents as potentially irredeemable. "Marcus, you're going to spend the rest of your life here," Dr. Winters said during their first session. "You're 18 years old. You could potentially live another 60, 70 years behind these walls. Have you thought about what that means? How you want to spend that time?" Marcus looked at the psychologist with those same flat eyes that had disturbed so many people before. "I'll read, study, stay out of trouble. What else is there?" Dr. Winters pressed further. "Don't you want to work on yourself? Try to develop empathy, understand what you did to Emily Carson and her family?" Marcus considered this. "Why? It won't change anything. She's still dead. I'm still here. Working on myself won't bring her back or get me released. It seems like wasted energy." The response troubled Dr. Winters deeply. Most inmates, even violent ones, eventually developed some capacity for remorse, or at least performed remorse convincingly to improve their prison conditions. Marcus seemed entirely uninterested in even pretending. He understood intellectually that he was supposed to feel guilty, but he couldn't generate the emotion and saw no practical reason to fake it within prison walls, where there were no parole boards to convince. Dr. Winters documented his concerns in Marcus's file. Inmate Cole demonstrates continued lack of genuine remorse or empathy. He views his incarceration as an inconvenience rather than deserved punishment. While he shows no signs of immediate behavioral problems, his psychological profile remains concerning. He lacks the emotional connections that typically prevent violence, viewing others primarily as objects rather than people with inherent worth. Recommend ongoing monitoring and maximum security housing. The assessment confirmed what everyone who'd evaluated Marcus had concluded. He was compliant, but fundamentally unchanged. Intelligent, but emotionally hollow. Manageable, but permanently dangerous. After 6 weeks in protective custody, Marcus was moved into general population, placed in a cell block housing other lifers. Prison officials reasoned that inmates serving life sentences were often more stable than those with shorter terms, less likely to engage in violence that could extend their sentences. Marcus's cellmate was a 43-year-old man named Raymond Torres, who'd been incarcerated for 20 years after killing 2 people during an armed robbery. Raymond had spent his first decade in prison as an angry, violent inmate who'd accumulated numerous disciplinary infractions. But the second decade had brought something resembling wisdom and resignation. He'd gotten his GED, worked prison jobs, attended counseling, and made peace with dying behind bars. When Raymond first met his new teenage cellmate, his initial instinct was protective. This kid looked young, vulnerable, an easy target for predators. But that instinct died quickly. There was something about Marcus's eyes, about the way he moved through space, that signaled he wasn't vulnerable at all. "What are you in for?" Raymond asked during their first evening together. Marcus answered without hesitation. "I murdered a pregnant woman when I was 14. Life without parole." The casual way he said it, like mentioning he'd been caught shoplifting, made Raymond's blood run cold. The two cellmates developed a strange coexistence over the following months. Raymond talked about his crimes, his regrets, his family who'd stopped visiting years ago. Marcus listened without commenting, neither judging nor empathizing, simply absorbing information like he absorbed everything else, storing it away in that analytical mind. Raymond eventually stopped trying to connect with his cellmate on an emotional level. "You're different, kid," Raymond said one night. "I've been locked up with killers, rapists, every kind of criminal you can imagine. Most of them are angry or broken or crazy. But you're just empty. It's like there's nothing inside where a soul should be." Marcus considered this assessment. "Does that bother you?" he asked. Raymond shook his head slowly. "Bothers me less than it should. That's what 20 years in here does. Makes you numb to most things. But yeah, kid, it bothers me. Because I killed people in rage, in desperation for money. I can look back and see the moment where I could have made different choices. But you planned it. You wanted to know what killing felt like. That's not rage or desperation. That's something else. Something colder." The conversation ended there, but it captured the essence of how Marcus was perceived in prison, not as just another violent offender, but as something fundamentally other. Marcus established routines that would define his prison years. He enrolled in correspondence courses, working toward a college degree through programs available to inmates. His intelligence made the coursework easy, and he completed assignments with the same methodical efficiency he'd applied to planning Emily's murder. He read voraciously: philosophy, psychology, literature, history, his mind consuming knowledge without apparent purpose since he'd never use it outside prison walls. He worked prison jobs when required, performing tasks adequately but without enthusiasm. He avoided trouble meticulously, understanding that violence or rule-breaking would result in losing privileges he valued, particularly access to books and educational materials. Guards found him easy to manage. He followed orders, never talked back, caused no problems. But they also found him unsettling, something about his compliance feeling performative, his cooperation masking rather than reflecting genuine reformation. One guard described him in a report. "Inmate Cole is a model prisoner in terms of behavior, but remains emotionally disconnected from everything around him. He goes through motions without apparent internal experience. It's like watching a very sophisticated robot programmed to mimic human behavior." Other inmates generally left Marcus alone. Word spread quickly about his crime. Killing a pregnant woman at 14 earned him a reputation as someone to avoid rather than challenge. Those who tried to intimidate or test him found themselves facing someone who simply didn't respond to threats the way normal people did. Marcus didn't get angry or scared. He just stared at aggressors with empty eyes until they backed off, disturbed by the complete absence of fear or emotion. A few inmates tried to befriend him, usually lifers like Raymond who'd accepted their fate and sought companionship to ease the monotony of endless years. Marcus tolerated these overtures but never reciprocated genuinely. He'd participate in conversations, answer questions, even laugh occasionally at jokes. But everyone who interacted with him eventually reached the same conclusion. Marcus was performing social interaction without actually connecting. He'd learned to simulate human behavior well enough to function, but there was no authentic emotion behind the simulation. He was like an actor playing a role, competent, but never truly present. Diana continued writing to Marcus regularly, though his responses remained sporadic and emotionless. She'd moved through various stages of grief and acceptance over the years. Initial devastation, then desperate hope for his rehabilitation, then gradual resignation that her son would never become the person she'd hoped he'd be. By the time Marcus turned 21, Diana had stopped expecting transformation. She wrote because abandoning him completely felt like final admission of failure, not because she believed her words reached him in any meaningful way. Her letters contained updates about her life, a new job, a move to another apartment, the changing seasons. Marcus's replies, when they came, were brief and factual. I completed another course. The food here is terrible. Thank you for the books you sent. No, I love you. No, I miss you. No acknowledgement of the pain his actions had caused or the sacrifices Diana had made trying to raise him. The absence of emotional content in his letters said everything about who Marcus was and would remain. Diana kept writing anyway because mothers don't stop being mothers even when their children become monsters, even when hope is long dead. As years accumulated, Marcus became a fixture at Riverside, the lifer who'd come in as a teenager and would leave as an old man in a coffin. He watched other inmates arrive and depart, either released after serving their sentences or transferred to different facilities. He aged slowly from 18 to 25, his face losing its youthful softness, his body adapting to prison routine. He witnessed violence, stabbings over debts or disrespect, fights breaking out in the yard, guards subduing inmates who'd reached their breaking point. Marcus observed these incidents with detached interest, analyzing the psychology and dynamics without experiencing any emotional reaction to the blood or suffering. One particularly brutal incident involved an inmate being beaten nearly to death over a gambling dispute. Other prisoners and even some guards looked away, disturbed by the violence. Marcus watched with the clinical interest of a researcher observing an experiment. When questioned about his lack of reaction, he simply said, "Why would I look away? It doesn't affect me." That statement, more than any violent act he might have committed, cemented his reputation as someone fundamentally different from everyone around him. Dr. Winters continued meeting with Marcus quarterly, documenting his complete lack of progress toward anything resembling rehabilitation. "Marcus, you've been here 7 years now. You're 25 years old. Your brain has finished developing. This is who you are. Does that concern you at all?" Marcus thought about the question. "Should it? I'm adapted to this environment. I have routines I find acceptable. I don't experience distress. Why would I be concerned?" Dr. Winters tried a different approach. "Don't you ever think about Emily Carson? About the life you took? About her mother who still grieves?" Marcus's response was chilling in its honesty. "I think about it sometimes, yes, but thinking about it doesn't produce the emotions you're expecting. I understand intellectually that what I did caused suffering. I understand that most people would feel guilt, but I don't feel it. I never have. Pretending otherwise seems pointless when there's no parole possibility and therefore no practical benefit to performing remorse." Dr. Winters closed his notebook, realizing that after 7 years of quarterly sessions, Marcus hadn't moved a single inch toward genuine remorse or empathy. If anything, he'd simply become more articulate about his emotional deficits, more comfortable explaining his inability to connect with human suffering. The psychologist's final note in that session's report was bleak. "After 7 years of observation and attempted intervention, I must conclude that inmate Cole is exactly what he appeared to be at age 14, an individual fundamentally lacking in empathy with no apparent capacity for developing it. He will likely remain psychologically unchanged for the duration of his natural life." 20 years had passed since Emily Carson's murder. 2 decades of seasons changing, holidays arriving and departing, life continuing for some while, others remained frozen in time. Patricia Hayes was now in her 70s, her hair completely silver, her body bent slightly from years of carrying grief too heavy for any human frame. She still visited Emily's grave every Sunday without fail, weather permitting, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the bench nearby to talk to her daughter. Lily would be 20 years old now, she'd whisper to the headstone that marked both their resting places. I wonder what she would have studied in college. I wonder if she'd have your laugh, your kindness. These conversations with the dead were the only way Patricia knew to maintain connection with the future that had been stolen. Robert had passed away 5 years earlier, his heart giving out. The doctors said cardiovascular disease, but Patricia knew better. He'd died of a broken heart, the grief finally overwhelming a body that had carried it too long. She lived alone now in a smaller house, surrounded by photographs of Emily at every age, a shrine to a daughter who would be 44 if Marcus Cole hadn't decided to conduct his deadly experiment. The elementary school where Emily had worked had changed significantly over 2 decades. New teachers who'd never met Emily now taught in classrooms where she'd once helped struggling students. But the memorial garden remained, tended carefully by successive generations of staff and students who understood they were honoring someone important even if they'd never known her. The scholarship fund established in Emily's name had helped dozens of single mothers pursue education, creating ripples of positive impact that spread outward from tragedy. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem what had been lost. But it was transformation, taking senseless death and creating meaning from it. Patricia attended the annual memorial assembly each year, watching children who'd never met her daughter learn about kindness, about loss, about the importance of seeing each other as fully human. These moments offered bittersweet comfort. Emily's life had mattered. People remembered. The world had been changed, however slightly, by her existence and her absence. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something to hold on to in the darkest moments. Diana Cole had disappeared from public view entirely, changing her name legally and moving to a different state where no one knew her history. She'd stopped writing to Marcus 10 years earlier, after decades of unanswered emotional pleas finally breaking whatever hope she'd clung to. The decision to cut contact had been agonizing. Every maternal instinct screamed against abandoning her child, even a child who'd become a monster. But the relationship had become purely one-sided suffering, Diana pouring out her heart to someone incapable of receiving it, each cold response or long silence cutting deeper than the last. She'd finally accepted that Marcus didn't need her, didn't want her in any genuine sense, tolerated her letters only as mild entertainment during otherwise monotonous prison days. Walking away from that reality had been necessary for Diana's survival, though guilt about the decision haunted her remaining years. She'd remarried eventually to a widower who knew her past and accepted it, finding some measure of peace in building a new life disconnected from the tragedy that had defined her for so long. But she never had more children. The fear that whatever had gone wrong with Marcus might repeat was too powerful to overcome. Marcus, now 34 years old, had spent exactly half his life in prison. The teenage boy who'd entered Riverside at 18 had become a middle-aged man with graying temples and lines beginning to etch themselves around his eyes. He'd completed multiple college degrees through correspondence programs, psychology, philosophy, literature, filling his time with intellectual pursuits that served no purpose except occupying his highly intelligent mind. He'd read thousands of books, written journal entries analyzing human behavior he observed in prison, became something of an informal advisor to other inmates who sought his insight on various matters. His reputation in prison had evolved from the kid who killed a pregnant woman to the lifer who understands how things work, a shift that reflected both time and Marcus's ability to navigate prison politics without ever genuinely connecting to anyone around him. Guards who'd worked at Riverside long enough to remember Marcus's arrival marveled at how little he'd fundamentally changed, despite 2 decades of supposed maturation. His behavior remained compliant, his intelligence continued developing, but that essential emptiness at his core persisted unchanged. Dr. Winters had retired 5 years earlier, but his successor, Dr. Jennifer Morrison, continued the quarterly psychological evaluations that documented Marcus's ongoing lack of progress toward rehabilitation. These sessions had become almost ritualistic. Dr. Morrison would ask the same basic questions about remorse, empathy, and insight into his crimes, and Marcus would provide the same honest answers, acknowledging he understood intellectually what he should feel while admitting he didn't actually feel it. "Marcus, you're 34 years old now," Dr. Morrison said during one session. "You've been incarcerated for 20 years. In another 20 years, you'll be 54, then 74, then you'll die here. Does that prospect ever trouble you?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Not especially. Prison is my reality. I've adapted to it. I have routines, intellectual stimulation, basic needs met. Is it the life I would have chosen? No. But dwelling on alternatives I can't access seems counterproductive. I exist in the circumstances that resulted from my actions. That's simply reality." Dr. Morrison tried to dig deeper. "But don't you ever feel you're wasting your intelligence, your potential? You could have been anything, a doctor, a lawyer, a researcher. Instead, you're spending your entire life in a cell." Marcus shrugged. "Potential is meaningless without opportunity. I forfeited my opportunities when I killed Emily Carson. That was a choice I made with full awareness of probable consequences. Living with those consequences doesn't require emotional distress, just acceptance." The conversations captured perfectly why Marcus remained classified as maximum security despite 2 decades of perfect behavioral compliance. He wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense. He didn't start fights, didn't threaten people, didn't violate rules, but he remained fundamentally disconnected from normal human emotion and moral reasoning. He understood cause and effect, understood rules and consequences, but lacked the emotional architecture that prevented most people from harming others. He was safe only insofar as harming people in prison offered him no benefit and significant cost. But if circumstances changed, if his cost-benefit analysis shifted, nothing internal would stop him from violence. He remained what he'd always been, someone for whom other people weren't quite real, whose decisions were guided entirely by rational self-interest, unconstrained by empathy or conscience. Dr. Morrison's reports consistently concluded that Marcus posed an ongoing risk and should never be considered for release under any circumstances, not because he'd done anything wrong during incarceration, but because nothing fundamental had changed about the mind that had methodically planned and executed Emily Carson's murder. Periodically, Marcus's case resurfaced in public discourse as new debates emerged about juvenile sentencing. Legal scholars cited his case in articles both supporting and opposing life without parole for minors. Some argued that Marcus proved some young offenders were indeed beyond rehabilitation and dangerous enough to warrant lifetime incarceration. Others argued his case proved nothing, except that society had given up on a child without providing adequate intervention during his formative years. Documentary filmmakers requested interviews that Marcus declined. True crime podcasters discussed his case, dissecting the psychology of a teenage killer. These attention cycles came and went, temporarily reviving interest in Marcus Cole before public focus shifted to newer tragedies. Marcus himself remained indifferent to his minor notoriety. Being infamous or forgotten made no practical difference to his daily existence. He lived in a 9x12 cell, followed prison routines, read books, and waited for time to pass. His life had narrowed to the confines of Riverside Correctional Institution, and within those confines he'd achieved a strange equilibrium. Not happiness, but not suffering either. Just existence, year after year, decade after decade. Emily's friends from college occasionally gathered to remember her, their reunions tinged with sadness for the friend who should have been there. They'd moved forward with their lives, marriages, children, careers, divorces, grandchildren, experiencing everything Emily never would. At each gathering, someone would raise a toast to Emily's memory, and they'd share favorite stories, keeping her alive in the only way they could. But as years passed and the group aged, the stories became more distant, filtered through the softening haze of time. Emily remained forever 24 in their memories, young and vital, while they grew older and further from the people they'd been when they knew her. It was the peculiar cruelty of losing someone young. The departed stayed frozen while everyone else continued aging, the gap between memory and reality widening until the person remembered bore little resemblance to the person they'd actually been. Emily became more symbol than person, a representation of potential lost rather than a complex human with flaws and contradictions. The real Emily, with her annoying habits and petty frustrations and ordinary struggles, faded into an idealized ghost that bore little resemblance to the woman who'd actually existed. Detective Martinez, now fully retired and in her late 70s, occasionally thought about the Marcus Cole case, particularly on quiet evenings when old memories surfaced unbidden. She'd investigated dozens of homicides during her career, but Marcus's confession remained the most disturbing thing she'd ever witnessed. The casual way he'd described murder, the complete absence of remorse, the cold calculation behind every choice, those memories still sent chills through her decades later. Martinez had made peace with most of her career, accepting that she'd done her job well and brought justice to many victims. But Marcus troubled her in ways she'd never fully resolved. Had there been some intervention point where things could have gone differently? Some moment where the right question or observation might have revealed his dangerous psychology before he killed? She'd examined that possibility thousands of times over the years and always reached the same conclusion. No, probably not. Marcus had been too good at hiding his true nature, too intelligent and controlled to reveal himself before he chose to act. Still, the question lingered, a reminder of the limitations inherent in any justice system, however diligent. You couldn't prevent crimes you didn't know were coming, couldn't identify threats that looked like ordinary children until it was too late. On the 20th anniversary of Emily's death, Patricia Hayes organized a small memorial service attended by family members, a few of Emily's friends who remained in the area, and some staff from the elementary school. They gathered at Emily's grave, placing flowers and sharing memories, acknowledging that 2 decades had passed since a senseless act of violence had stolen 2 lives. Patricia spoke briefly, her voice trembling but determined. Emily would be 44 today. Lily would be 20. I've spent 20 years imagining the lives they should have had, the moments we should have shared. That future was taken by someone who saw my daughter not as a person, but as an experiment, who valued his curiosity more than her life. I'll never understand that. I'll never forgive it. But I've learned to carry this grief, to make space for it alongside the love I still feel for Emily and Lily. They mattered. Their lives had value. And as long as I'm alive, I'll make sure they're remembered. The gathering concluded with silence, each person lost in private reflections on loss, justice, time's passage, and the enduring impact of violence on everyone it touches. That same evening, Marcus sat in his cell at Riverside, unaware that 20 years had passed since Emily's death, because marking such anniversaries held no meaning for him. He was reading a book on existential philosophy, occasionally pausing to consider arguments about meaning and purpose in human existence. His cellmate, a newer arrival serving 25 years for armed robbery, watched him with the same unease everyone eventually felt around Marcus. "Do you ever think about the person you killed? the cellmate asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Marcus looked up from his book, considering whether to engage. Finally, he answered with characteristic honesty. Sometimes, but not in the way you're imagining. I don't feel guilt or regret. I think about it the way you might think about a significant decision you made, analytically, examining cause and effect, considering what I learned from the experience. The emotional content you're expecting isn't there. It never was. The cellmate fell silent, disturbed by the answer, and Marcus returned to his reading. Outside, the sun set on the 20th anniversary of the day Marcus Cole had destroyed multiple lives, and the world continued turning, indifferent to grief and justice alike, carrying everyone, victims, survivors, perpetrators, forward through time toward whatever endings awaited them all. The case of Marcus Cole and Emily Carson would remain in court records, in newspaper archives, in academic discussions about juvenile justice. It would be cited, debated, examined, and eventually forgotten as newer tragedies captured public attention. Emily's memorial garden would eventually be redesigned, her name fading from institutional memory as staff who remembered her retired. Patricia Hayes would eventually pass away, taking with her the direct personal grief that had defined 2 decades of her life. Diana Cole would die without ever reconciling what her son had become. And Marcus himself would age slowly in prison, reading books and existing in his peculiar emotional vacuum until his body finally gave out decades hence. The living connection to the crime would gradually disappear, leaving only records and second-hand accounts, the tragedy reduced to data points in larger discussions about crime, punishment, youth, and justice. This was the inevitable trajectory of all tragedies, burning bright with immediate pain before slowly cooling into history, remembered imperfectly, if at all, by future generations who never knew the people involved. Emily and Lily had mattered immensely to those who loved them, but ultimately they became statistics, cautionary tales, case numbers in a criminal justice system that processed thousands of murders each year. That was the final injustice. Not just death itself, but the inevitable forgetting that followed, the world moving on because it had no choice, life continuing because it always does, leaving behind only fading memories and unanswered questions about how someone so young could become something so monstrous, and whether justice had truly been served or merely approximated as best as an imperfect system could manage.